all on Zoom this afternoon. Thank you very much for participating.
Rebecca.
So if everyone can just make sure they speak clearly into the microphone so that our three colleagues can hear, that would be much appreciated. So the way we're going to run this today is that the officers have got a presentation of about 15 minutes, and then people can ask questions. I'm just going to you can ask 3 questions, and then we'll put you on the speaking list for the second or the third or the fourth time. I would like to finish by 5 o'clock, but that is in your hands at the latest. If it needs to be shorter, that's good too. But I think it's important that we thoroughly test this. So, thank you, officers. Off you go.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Kia ora tātou. Nau mai haere mai. Kia tēnā hui, councillors. Welcome to this pre-committee briefing. It's a real privilege to present this material to councillors. Obviously, it's been a long road. We commenced this work in 2017 under our City Tomorrow, and in 2019, you guys, the collective council, chose a compact growth scenario, and we've been proceeding on that basis. I've got about 9 slides, which is really just summarising the changes but providing context, and then touching on a few of the more complex changes that I've fielded questions from both the councillors and the community since the plan was live. So that will frame, if you like, a conversation for Q&As. And I've got Sherilyn, Kate and John McSweeney to help answer some of the Q&As. We've also got Andrew, I think, at the back here. Correct, Andrew's the expert on the Johnsonville line. We have Tabitha as well, who Tabitha did all the calculations and computations, if you like, on the character precincts and character areas. So a lot of the mapping work in particular. We've also got Orla. Orla is our GIS whiz, and she worked on the walking catchments and can clarify what changed there as well. So I'll proceed, and perhaps just for now we'll go through the 9 slides that I have and the notes that the key points I'd like to get across to you, and then we'll open for questions. So, starting off, these 5 settings, if you like, were what the goals were identified by Council when we embarked on this Our City Tomorrow program. We talk about a compact city, and that relates, of course, to the growth scenario you chose. A resilient city, so a lot of hazard information has been feeding into this work. A greener city, always a lens through the spatial plan has been how do we achieve our low carbon city objectives and our Te Atakura objective as well, of course. Vibrancy and prosperity in both business and retail, commercial, and inclusive and connected. Now, this covers not only transport infrastructure, but just trying to understand how, in a low-carbon city, how connected our people can be by walking and cycling through the city. So they're the lenses, if you like, the goals we've been taking through the plan. I just wanted to make it quite clear from the outset about what this thing is, what this spatial plan actually represents. Best practice across the globe, if you like, have been cities, regions, looking to produce 30-year, 50-year, 100-year plans. These are plans to try to understand that one constant that always happens in cities is that it grows and evolves, and the evolution of cities need quite a high altitude look at the performance of social, economic, environmental and cultural changes in population and places. So I want you to think about this blueprint as it's been picked up, indeed by the media, as a blueprint. It is an opportunity for us to take a breath from our current operative district plan, old settings, first generation RMA plan in the 90s. We've gone up at a high altitude to have a look at where we're going as a city. That's, in a blueprint sense, going to inform the rulebook. And the rulebook, of course, is the district plan, which we're starting to draft. And Council's chosen to review that district plan in its entirety. Now, the spatial plan is non-statutory, okay? It's not something that can be litigated in court, but it will be used and referenced in court as we produce the district plan, head towards planning commissioners and environment court for whatever matter that might be contested. It's a guide. It guides both investment in our asset management strategy, but hopefully investment by the development community and the community more broadly in the city. It has absolutely interdependencies with everything else we do in council. In particular, our strategies, how we formulate them, whether they're economic or infrastructure. The spatial plan has been able to go and hover at an altitude and lead, frankly, a lot of the other government agencies out there who were looking to be led and looking for direction for the city. And that's probably been not only a privilege, but a really welcome opportunity for this planning unit to lead the city in its thinking, and a great outcome more broadly. So on the district plan, it's the rule book, right? So this is where we give effect not only to the NPS-UD, but we also give effect to the consistency in regional planning instruments, regional land transport plan, regional policy statements, all of which the district plan needs to refer to and take guidance and leadership from. It goes down to the coalface of how the city develops, and indeed how housing, importantly, develops. Whether it's through subdivision rules or guidelines, okay? It's quite an important distinction, but both are mutually very, very connected. Just a quick update on timeline. I've mentioned we started this journey in 2017, but we've got really only halfway through. 2024 is when we expect the decisions from our hearings on the district plan to be back in for council consideration. We are at this point in time about to consider the adoption on Thursday of the draft spatial plan as recommended by officers, but of course at the same time we've just started drafting the district plan, of which you've all been briefed and shared, if you like, with some of the emerging themes that are coming through in that. Just more in a goal sense, which I failed to mention, and I have a slide later on I want to talk about, is the role of mana whenua in the plan making, and the plan making in both of the spatial plan but also the district plan. It's an element we've introduced since the draft went out. It's an element that's been responded to both by submissions and by council's own intent, and we believe it's capturing in partnership with mana whenua, their desires and aspirations for the city more broadly. And I'll talk to some of the details on how we've tried to integrate their involvement in the spatial plan today. So, key changes. I'm going to go through a series of dot points, all of which I believe some of you will have questions in and around throughout the day, and but at a high level, set some context in terms of the changes that have been made. If there's anything in there that comes to your attention, please jot them down, note them, and we'll try to answer in detail when we get into Q&A. Thank you. So 2,897 submissions later, I think, every single one of them read and investigated, have produced a series of changes to the plan. And I've already mentioned the recognition and integration of mana whenua's aspirations. These changes will hopefully permeate not through the spatial plan but through the district plan. But I'll just start more generally around what those changes are. So infrastructure investment approach to a long capacity for growth. A lot of feedback we received both from councillors and submitters over the period indicated that if we are going to cater for these 50 to 80,000 people over this 30-year period, how is our infrastructure going to cope and being planned for and funded over that time? It's been quite an effort for officers to get and work alongside other agencies, whether it's Wellington Water or Wellington Electricity, for example, and understand what their future thinking and planning for their networks were. In the LTP, councillors might remember that we've left headroom there. We've acknowledged we haven't programmed or catered for all of the growth, but the headroom will allow information that comes to light over the next 3 years to inform the next 2024 LTP that will plug any of the infrastructure gaps that might be, and we know that are out there. So what councillors have funded through the long-term plan is effectively discovery work where Wellington Water can get and understand what we don't know, and includes some practical growth projects as well. And we touch on that as well through the presentation and through the evidence in the spatial plan. Areas like Johnsonville, Tawa, the inner city, have all been identified for practical infrastructure investments over the next 3 years. But the key point we should remember is that this LTP facilitated discovery planning work for the agencies, in particular Wellington Water, to tell us what we don't know and inform the next LTP. Pre-1930s character areas, very broadly discussed, very emotive to some degree. I wanted to just highlight some of the changes there, and I'll detail that in a future slide. But we have reviewed some of our background reports, we've reviewed the submissions, and we've made some changes and increased some of these character precincts. In doing so, we've also removed an element of a character overlay that we had, both on advice from officers and legal advice about what's implementable and enforceable, and in fact what's practical and easy to use. So we've lifted the requirements for those character overlays, and at the same time, whilst increased our character precinct protection areas, we've loosened up, if you like, the adjacent areas to those to allow for further development. We've tried to manage the interface of that relationship with the character precincts to the more broader areas that are adjacent to it, with design conditions such as recession planes, etc., to ensure that there's an appropriate transition from what's not a character precinct to a character precinct. And when I say transition, I mean how the buildings talk to those adjacent areas. We've reviewed the walking catchment and spatial extents throughout the city. We've looked at more precise calculations around pedestrian permeability, the process and access of pathways to transit-orientated areas, such as train stations, and that's had a refinement and a change in some of those walking catchment areas, which of course have consequential impacts on growth potential. We have removed the city height settings. We're allowing, save for certain areas such as Oriental Parade, Thornton Quay for hazard issues, sightlines to particular landscape settings more broadly, but cities itself, the height settings have been removed altogether to allow for additional height and additional density. We've included 5 additional opportunity sites. We have 5 existing. These opportunity sites are intelligence, if you like, that's been gathered over the period that indicates there are other entities and agencies out there that are looking to develop quite intensively and develop in a complex mixed-use way across the city and certain hubs, and we've acknowledged those sites. 2 examples are, of course, Johnsonville with Stride Development and Strathmore Park with Kāinga Orderers land holdings and opportunities that might sit around there. We have made some recommendations and it included additional information on natural hazards and climate change, and that relates to some of the more detailed early work in our district plan relating to ground conditions, shaking, fault rupture zones and sea level rise, coastal inundation, that sort of thing. We've updated our implementation approach. I've outlined a little bit about that in terms of what we don't know. We're looking and discovering what we don't know so we can inform a revised plan in 3 years' time, and we've looked at an action plan that sets out how we're going to do that. The spatial plan structure, usability, presentation of all that information is also being changed based on submissions for improved readability. So that's the context setting at a high level, and I'll just talk now about the pre-1930s character areas. I want to make it quite clear and surface this, because we know it's obviously very contentious and it's received a lot of commentary. So, as I said before, we have revised this method. We've gone back over the various reports that supported those sub-areas, we've renamed them character precincts, and we've expanded some of the character precincts. We have tables and calculations on the expansion areas, what areas have gained and what areas haven't, and we can talk to those in detail. But I wanted to just draw your attention to the top right-hand bubble there, we are only talking about 6.8% of the city's housing stock in these areas, these pre-1930 character protection areas. And as a percentage, that's a very small amount across the city. The opportunities for growth isn't necessarily in these areas. The lots are generally smaller, and they are older, of course. Hence their heritage and character precincts that are currently set in the operative district plan, and hence the historical reason why they've been set there. What's important to note through the change is that we have removed the general character overlay, and that was a total of 147 hectares, and enabled at least 6 stories development around those areas. And I've already talked to how we're trying to manage that transition with recession plans and design guidelines to help the transition from these more open areas for development to the character precinct. We started with 300 hectares, if you like, protected by the pre-1930s character areas. We went to a draft spatial plan to 88. We received submissions, we reviewed our material, and we've moved that 88 hectares back up to 127.3 hectares. So the important point here is overall we've had, from the operative district plan and the removal of the character precincts, we've increased the ability for the city to take growth by 58% to the current operative plan settings. And that's quite a substantial change. The question is, and the question for councillors to debate and answer is it enough? So infrastructure investment more broadly, I think I've gone into quite a bit of detail in terms of what that change has been. The recent Dominion Post article talking about the infrastructure costs, the future costs, I mean, it is correct. We obviously have future costs to ensure our infrastructure's there and the capacity is there to be for growth to be met by infrastructure. The design and placement of it's really, really important. And the page referring in the summary document to the spatial plan is trying to indicate both a level of investment from the local government and territorial authority, that is Wellington City Council and its agencies, to invest in areas where we think growth in the short term is more likely and indeed more ready to happen. But as I've mentioned before, we are in a process of discovery, and by the next LTP I expect we'll know a lot more about our network. The Council's long-term plan included quite a bit of this funding for Wellington Water to refine this detail and determine exactly where and what's required in each of the suburbs. And we've talked a little bit about the quite severe constraints in Karori. The work that Wellington Water are doing is going to address these particular issues. And we, as I say, for the LTP 2024, we hope to have a far better picture of the status of our growth potential. Walking catchments, the review and update of those. The NPS is quite open in terms of how walking catchments are defined. We've gone for a 5 and 10 minute catchment rule, and that's defined by amenity. The catchment rule has been revised. It's basically revised on this idea of what is the average walking speed. We all walk at different speeds. We've been trying to find international benchmarks and practices. We've looked at slope topography. We've looked at pedestrian permeability, importantly. We've found routes, if you like, and trails and road reserves that have allowed and already exist residents to access areas to train stations with the appropriate amenity around them much faster than we initially thought, and that's based on to a lot of help from residents who have made submissions challenging the walking catchments, and that's why that review's happened. So through submissions and a general review more broadly on, as I say, speeds, topography, pedestrian permeability, we've reviewed those catchments to the extent that, as Naya an example, some of the areas in black with their previous catchments, the new catchments are in red. You can see some growth and retraction of those walking catchments. That has more broadly across the city had a reduction in the area of walkability from a 5 to 10 minute rule, and this is a rule that's been developed by Orla and her team. It's a methodology and a calculation that's, as I say, reasonably fresh and new. It's a methodology that's easily open to interpretation, and I don't profess to say that's or nor the team says that that's actually how people get around their city, but it's really, really important to understand that it is the theory, if you like, behind why we're intensifying around train stations in certain areas. And we believe the evidence base is important as we go forward into district plan, planning commissioner, and then ultimately potentially environment court hearings, but acknowledging it is open to interpretation. And just the final slide, councillors, is the mana whenua integration. We've got quite a bit of time to answer questions this afternoon, but I thought this was a really important and quite an encouraging change to not only the spatial plan, but it's informing the making of the district plan. Initially in the district plan, we were considering we'd have one mana whenua chapter, but what we've discovered is that their ability to contribute and add value to the making of the district plan actually permeates through every single chapter and every single rule, to be fair, and policy that we might be looking at. They have a very exciting and holistic view on how the city grows, and so this list of mana whenua integration really just relates to the concept of partnership within the spatial plan, but more broadly the partnership and the plan making for the district plan. We've covered most goals, I believe, that they have been encouraging us to consider, and I really look forward to working with them as we build the district plan.
I forgot to welcome members of the public to this chamber today, and those watching online, if there are any. I'm sure there are. Right, okay, so if we just do the 3 questions protocol, but just do feel free to put yourself on the list again. So Councillor Matthews first.
Okay, so my first one is about that sort of key question about, is it enough? And so my question is what's the range of dwellings, or what's the number of dwellings we are planning for? Have we included a high growth scenario? And have we considered the smaller household sizes and sort of demographics in that? And have we included a catch-up of the current shortfall? I know it says in our papers that there's a shortfall of between 4,000 and 5,000 homes in Wellington, but my understanding is that's very conservative. And I've heard Shamabeel Yaqub talk about 10,000, and people have talked about even more. So it's about that number. How are we factoring in the current shortfall, demographic changes, and the potential for high growth?
Thanks, Councillor. I'll try to answer the first question. The team can chip in afterwards. Just on the question relating to how many houses are we planning for, we've broken the city up into, obviously, the city centre, the inner suburbs, the outer growth suburbs, greenfill areas, Upper Stebbings and Lincolnshire Farms in particular, and of course we have a citywide total here. So of total dwellings in the recommended version to you, we've got a range. Now the range is there because of this science is not exact. It's a whole lot of assumptions, just like our walking catchments, a lot of assumptions that sit behind it, and there will be people and agencies for that matter, whether it's Stats New Zealand or the Treasury or Sense Partners who advise us, who will have vastly different projections for growth. So I just wanted to put some context around that. So recommended version, dwellings, we have a range of 22,900 to 29,600, and that equates to about 56,000 to 73,800 people. I'm hoping my officers took on Rebecca's questions there, because I'll hand it over to you to answer the second question.
Maybe just to fill out that detail a little bit. So those figures there are based on across the city, but it's really important to note that It's based on an assumption of, which is similar to the draft spatial plan, where we're saying a doubling of the central city population over the next 30 years. With the change in the proposed final to having no height limits over most of the central city, we think that's going to be quite a conservative amount of only 18,000. So it could well be a lot more. We haven't modelled it yet. It's a very difficult thing to model when you don't have height limits. But I think we can be pretty confident and say that it's going to be substantially higher than 18,000 over the next 30 years. Probably the second point really is that depending on what you decide, councillors, through the district plan, we will need to look at the infill approach to infill development across the city and outer residential areas. So that's another thing you can't easily factor in at this stage in terms of the actual numbers. And probably the third point to make also is because of the NPS UD saying that we no longer have to require developers people to provide on-site car parking, that potentially will open up a lot of further infill development, because one of the big restrictions on infill development in Wellington City is the fact that you need to provide on-site car parking, as well as obviously access up to that. So potentially a lot of hillside properties have a lot more development potential now than they previously did. So I suppose what I'm saying in summary, I think the figures we have here are still relatively conservative. We need to do more work through the district plan to model what the rules are and what that means in terms of additional capacity. So I actually feel quite confident that we've got a lot of capacity enabled and that will be reflected in the district plan.
Thanks, John. That's excellent. Just to add as well, Councillor Matthews, part of this modelling includes lots of assumptions, clearly, but one assumption we have made is this concept of uptake rates. So there's been a figure talked about, I believe, in the media around 14%. I just wanted to quickly step you through those uptake rates. So that's a methodology used based on the assumptions of growth throughout all our typologies. And if you recall, we've collapsed 4A and 4B typologies just down into 4, and I know that's confused people. We'll try to answer that in a moment. Those typologies have, because of the nature of where they are, have an uptake rate we've assigned to them. So type 2 typology, for example, which is out of sort of residential or sort of areas, has a higher uptake rate. And the reason for that is because the lots are bigger. Now,
Can I just clarify, by uptake rate, you mean the amount that's zoned, which is actually developed?
No, it's an estimate of development uptake. So what will be developed. So we've had to apply a lens. Not everyone wants to develop the land, right? So we've tried to make some assumptions around what's the actual uptake rate of these typologies that we've assigned the city. And the important thing to note is that 14% comes from the areas of our city that have much smaller lot sizes. And the much smaller lot sizes, unless you're parcelling up lots, these small lots all together in one big unit, which is quite difficult to do because each landowner has a different interest, whether they want to develop or not, we've assigned a lower uptake rate, and that's where that 14% comes from. And the outer suburbs, the uptake rate's higher. It's around 29%. So the uptake rate is part of the way we got to the numbers in the forecasts that I've just explained to you, both in dwellings and population. And it's just important to understand that we're trying to predict what the market will do, which is incredibly difficult, of course, which is why we've assigned a sort of a realisation value to the land we have upzoned in the city to cater for growth.
So nobody's answered my questions about household size or the current shortfall of housing stock.
Could you just repeat your question, please, again, Councillor?
So one question would be about, are we really accounting for the demographic changes, which means that we've got, a very decreasing household size, so a lot more 1 and 2 person households, and therefore we require more dwellings. And second of all, our existing shortfall of our estimates are at 5 and many are at like double that. And is that going to be accounted for in what we're enabling?
Okay, in terms of the household size, absolutely. It's a really key consideration. We know that household size is dropping, and we know that we have an undersupply of 1 and 2 bedroom dwellings across the city. Most of the city is traditionally 3 to 4 bedrooms. So that is a key part of our consideration and will be reflected in the district plan around whether we have certain controls around requiring developers to provide certain types of housing, so 1 and 2 bedroom or 3 or 4 bedrooms. So absolutely, that's a key consideration, and those things get factored into the ultimately expected number of dwellings that will likely come about through what is a very nuanced approach in the spatial plan, and will get reflected into the district plan. So the different typologies that we have described and enabled will be reflected in the district plan. So like terraced housing and more multi-unit developments, recognising that houses, allotment sizes are getting smaller, preferences are changing. We're going to have less, 3 or 4 bedroom houses on large lots. It's just not economically feasible in many cases also to provide that sort of housing. So absolutely, there are key considerations. In terms of the housing shortfall, I think this whole process that we're going through in terms of developing a spatial plan, which is trying to take a long-term approach to how we enable, how we match more closely demand in housing with the capacity and capability to provide for more housing through district plan settings, but also our infrastructure settings, is partly because, the burning platform is we have rampant housing unaffordability, we have an undersupply, very little housing being put on the market, and so it is all part of the whole consideration that we've been going through in terms of this work.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Day.
Thank you. Yes, I just want to thank you for the amazing work on this and the community interaction that you've had, and the goals are really good. I really like the goals, and great to see mana whenua right in there. So my first question's around the Glenside Upper Stebbings, reflecting on the goals and what they're telling us about how we want to develop. And I'm aware that obviously we're expecting to do more development in the Glenside Upper Stebbings area, like maybe up to 2,000 houses, I think it was, or dwellings it was originally identified as, and now we're down to sort of 500 or 600. So just my question really is, how does that fit? How does that sort of development fit with our goals, and that we're potentially creating a reasonably isolated community? And I'm not really understanding completely what sort of facilities would be up in that kind of corner of the city. I sort of understand we might have a community, maybe not even a community centre, but so I'm wondering if that fits with our goals, and if we feel like it's really going to deliver what we need for the city when we're saying we want to be compact and help people get around. So just if you want to speak to that, because obviously that one's changed through time.
I think it does fit within the goals. So it sort of touches on some of the comments I was making previously around creating and enabling a range of housing across the city, and part of that is also managing growth in our greenfield areas. So Upper Stebbings, you're alluding to, has long been identified as a growth area, and as has Lincolnshire Farm. So what we're doing with Upper Stebbings, as you know, we're doing a master plan where we're trying to, I suppose, extract as much housing out of that area, which is in quite a sensitive ecological area, but at the same time making sure it's a green community, it's a green suburb, walking paths and cycle paths, and protecting the really important Upper Stebbings stream. So yes, I think it's entirely consistent with the objectives. Lincolnshire Farms, we're reviewing the structure plan. There's a lot of low density housing enabled in the structure plan. So as part of the district plan review, we will be bringing to you a modified structure plan for approval, which is really about trying to get a higher number, but also more medium density housing. So.
Yeah, because I guess my concern at the moment is when I look at it on a map, I can just see we're going to create a car-dependent suburb, because there's not going to be a shop any shops there. So people will naturally go, I just want to go down and get the milk, and they're not going to wait for the bus to turn up to go and get that. Are we really going to create, or I guess achieve those goals for that? How do we work with the car dependency issue, which is something that we struggle with all over the city?
I mean, Upper Stebbings does have a bus route. I mean, it is the number one route. Does go all the way through to Chewton Park. It's not ideal, and as you know, we have been doing a lot of work looking at the ability to connect that across into Tawa. It's just the sheer cost and the topography, the streams, the whole range of ecological issues is very difficult to get across down into Tawa, and also get housing along the way. So as you alluded to, certainly the early work we did with the community was a lot more housing, at least 2,000. But the more work we've done, we've just not been able to make it stack up.
And that's because of the waterways?
Yeah, that and just the engineering costs of massive cuts, and it just would not be economic to develop that land. But also the other side of that is, of course, Glenside. I mean, through the fact that we haven't been able to enable that level of housing, also we're able to protect quite significant areas of Glenside with SNAs and potentially some landscape protection. And so, you know, that community is very passionate about the area, and, you know, we're working very closely with them. In terms of the structure plan proposed for that part for Glenside. So they have some concerns around development, but we are working with them to try and make sure it's as least impact on them as possible.
I've got a question about Johnsonville. So I wasn't on council when it was designated MDRA, so I don't understand the history completely of it. And obviously we went to the Environment Court, and the findings did impact on where we agreed to the walkable catchments being, but I'm aware that the walkable catchments that were agreed to under MDRA are actually different to what's being proposed here. So I guess I'm curious to know if officers have been out and looked at it and kind of looked at it you know, in a different way this time. What have we done on site to look at it? Because obviously, like Woodland Road, it doesn't have footpaths, and it never will because of the layout of the community there. So that sort of almost doesn't meet walkable, and probably never will. And then also the eastern side of the motorway, the access is pretty poor. I know even the mayor came and traipsed around there. Even the mayor came and joined us. Yeah, I'm sure you did, but I just want people to know you came to Johnsonville. But yeah, have you been and looked at the specifics? Because obviously we are getting into the specifics here, and the community are very aware of what they've done previously, and I'd like to understand it a bit better.
I will talk around the catchment, the modelling work and the specifics. I can just talk briefly about the MDRA. So I went all the way to the Environment Court on this one. So I sort of know about it. Yeah, the other side, so Sheridan Terrace, that area was included in the medium density area, and our position going into the court was that it should still be part of the, because it was argued it shouldn't be, because the access to it meant that it wasn't that accessible, but it is within 10 minutes walking distance, absolutely. However, and our view was that it should still be zoned medium density. The discussion we had with the Environment Court was that, on balance, they were of the view that it wasn't particularly accessible, but in the end it was decided because it was already developed for low density, it wouldn't mean a lot to actually zone it medium density. So whilst they didn't, I mean, it is within the walking catchment area, and I still think it should be, but that was the view that the Environment Court had.
I guess my question, just particularly around the Sheridan Terrace and more east of that, is that it's particularly steep and it's a lot of steps, so that's not accessible for anyone with a pushchair or even children trying to convince them to walk up and down those steps. So I do wonder if the reality will actually play out there, because people will naturally want to jump in a car and drive out.
So in relation to steps and things like that in the walking catchment, as I spoke to you previously, this model is designed to be repeated again and again as we have further improvements to it, and one of those improvements does include step access, so we're aware that the impact of going up and down stairs for some people hasn't fully been captured by the model, but it will be in future iterations. So we're still working on that at the moment, because to actually capture the gradient of steps when you're walking up is incredibly difficult. So we're still trying to work out the most efficient way to do that. Another goal of the walking model was to create something that was based on real world experiences for people. So that's why you might find in some areas there's no specific pathway, but the reality is people will walk in those areas. So we wanted to capture walking along the side of a road, cutting through a park where there's no designated pathway, because when you're out and about, that is what you do. If there is a shorter way to get something, you mightn't necessarily follow the exact paved way. And that also includes things like crossing the road. We know the reality is, as much as we wish people would cross at designated points, the reality is people don't. They take what's most efficient and what's easier for them. So we tried to capture as many real-world possibilities as we could.
I guess I'm still trying to work out how we are saying that is part of a walkable catchment. You have to go under the motorway, through a tunnel, up a whole lot of steps, and then it's very steep terrain. And I guess, just trying to understand how that fits with that previous finding, and whether we're just going to walk ourselves through the same process again and come out at the same answer.
Yeah, I think the previous finding, this relates to the Environment Court decision on medium density. Right? I think the commissioner at the time made the decision, and I think they used a pram, a mother and so that, I believe, as any commissioner would do, has probably used the sense check there. But in this instance, we've built a model that is evidence. So if and when the planners had the ability to stand up and present their case to the commissioner, it might not have included all his model, or it might have included all his model. I suspect it might have been a different conclusion if all his evidence had been presented in that particular case. So I guess what we're saying is that we now have evidence. It's a reasonably thorough methodology, and as all has already pointed out, we will be iterating it as we go on.
We'll go back on the list.
Well, it's really just the same question. So do we think that is more walkable for a mother and a child with a pram? I would say having
well, clearly it isn't. But the point about the catchments we're doing, we've tried to average across different types of people, not just mothers with prams, but also people in scooters, I suspect.
So what we found
with kids and so forth.
So what we found with the analysis is there is no average walking speed. There is no average walking distance. So we did have to come up with a way of finding something that would fit the majority of people. We are aware it doesn't capture everyone, but we're hoping it captures the majority.
Actually, just one last question on that, because the likelihood is that it's going to be a community where it will still have families living there. I mean, that's what it is now. It's a reasonably still affordable part of the city, whatever affordable is. But so I guess if you do overlay that, obviously you're trying to look at that kind of average group of people, but the reality is it will still probably be weighted towards families with children. So we might be a bit out of whack with that, with our model. I'm just wondering anyway. We'll go away and ponder it.
Thank you. Councillor Fitzsimons.
Hi, thank you. I've got 3 questions, as I'm allowed. The first one is, which is fair enough, what is the council rationale for protecting character homes, and why does that extend to the sunlight planes enjoyed by those homes?
I might start. So our starting point was the operative district plan, and character precincts or heritage precincts included that have been part of our planning system for several decades. So that's effectively our starting point. Over time, character precincts can and will have development. It just means the pre-1930 character areas, which is the earlier generation of the character precincts we're suggesting, always could have development happening in them, and they will continue to have development happening in them. The difference was that they needed a resource consent, and the development had to be a particular type and nature and design well to fit into the character areas. So when you look at it from a constraints point of view, that's quite a high bar to reach for development. It didn't mean development didn't happen. More broadly speaking, across New Zealand and cities across the world, they're full of character precincts. The heritage element, the neighbourhood character element defines a place. People associate and familiarise themselves with their city based on the character of the communities they live in. So it's a well-established planning paradigm, if you like, that character areas make cities, and they give cities distinctive features, feelings and experiences that are unique to that city. So in a planning professional sense, they're very common and they're very used to manage the growth and development of a city.
Maybe just further to that. So, I mean, the current policy settings and sort of it's being recommended through the spatial plan, they remain largely the same, which is based on a streetscape policy setting. So so it's how intact, I suppose, a street looks and feels when you walk down it. So it's the way individual buildings relate to the whole, as distinct from the heritage discussion that often plays out, which is, things, buildings and areas are heritage because they might have some association with someone who's famous, or they might have an association with a particular style of architecture or form of living that is relatively rare in Wellington, or there might be some other reason why. But it's a much higher bar, and it certainly represents a completely different approach to how you'd, I suppose, manage development in those areas. So streetscape really is slightly more enabling, but still with the pre-1930s demolition rule in place, it's quite a restrictive in terms of enabling a change, I suppose, in density or development over time.
Sorry, Councillor, that last question regarding daylight, can you just be a bit more specific?
Just that I had understood the reason for character was because of how it looked, but then I'm like, why does the sunlight planes that affect it get counted in terms of our planning rules if it's about how it looks? So I don't really understand why that's an element that's factored into that equation.
Was that my reference to recession planes, was it, as opposed to sunlight? Yeah, so no, recession planes are slightly different. The concept that the planners are recommending is that the transition between the developable areas of those neighbourhoods adjacent to these character areas is a design control called a recession plane, which is more about bulk and scale. So, and as John's pointed out, from a streetscape perspective, when you're looking at a precinct, a street that has a character precinct next door to an area that will develop, that there's an element of transition on the adjacent blocks that don't undermine, if you like, and are sensitive to the streetscape character of that precinct.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. My second question was really around, Liam, you mentioned that you'd had legal advice around the character overlays, but I haven't heard that before, and I haven't it's not written in the papers, and in the papers it basically says you did some more work and you listened to the submissions, and as the decision maker in this, I'm really keen to know about this legal advice that you've got that says the character overlay is not lawful, and I'd ideally like to see it because we're the ones that have to make a decision. Can you just unpack, first of all, that legal advice, and second of all, why that's the first time we're hearing about it today?
Yeah, okay, I apologise for that. This isn't an artefact of legal advice. It's just we have a technical reference panel that sit around the table, and then when we were looking and reviewing submissions and reviewing the background information, the character overlay was discussed in the technical review panel, and it was determined that in this instance it doesn't have any legal weight in the planning scheme. I'll let John talk to it in a bit more detail.
I think what we were trying to do with the draft spatial plan was to say, but what Liam was referring to in terms of recession planes is trying to manage the transition from those sub-areas, which were the real important character areas, into the broader area. We were saying around the area here we need to have probably lower heights, a transition type height, but that we would, in terms of the resource consent process, there'd be still a strong presumption or protection of character. Well, the more work we did on that, we thought it was too vague and didn't really probably would struggle to stand an evidential test, particularly with the MPS pushing us towards a lot more development capacity without, and you have to have pretty good reasons to control them. So what we're proposing is to acknowledge that those areas still do have character, so to go from what was in the the draft spatial plan to a broader area and to call that also, so that's all subject to the pre-1930s rule still, but then outside of those areas to raise the height, but also have a transition at the boundary. So it was a sort of I suppose, an idea that we put out, and which we can do through the spatial plan because it's not the district plan. It enables a broad discussion to have. And I think the submissions we received, which there was people weren't clear about what we're trying to achieve. We felt that there further sort of work needed to be done to be a lot more clear around what we were enabling and what we weren't.
So, because it's quite an important point, because it got described as a back down in response to opposition, but you're actually saying it was actually not workable and unlawful. So is there written legal advice the council has that we can read and understand better?
No, as I say, it was part of the technical review panel and advice we received. So
are there any other things that are part of that panel that haven't kind of been articulated in that way in here, or? No, okay. My final question really is, I'm concerned about the Our Place consultation process. I'm concerned about the name, which talks about it as being very focused on the people who live there now, whereas this project is actually about people who don't live there now. And I'm concerned that we're again misleading a community about the degree of say which they can have in the future. So I guess how is that, if you look at paragraph 42 of the paper, it talks about developers will have to take into account the documents that are prepared, or the project will result in a series of Our Place visions co-designed with communities through engagement directed through the framework. These visions will be specific to local neighbourhoods or areas within Wellington and should be considered by a developer when triggered to do so through the council's resource and consenting process. So first of all, how do we overcome this problem that actually, even by calling it Our Place, by engaging with people who already live there, there's a real problem around the different interests that may exist between people who already live there and actually enabling growth, which is what this was all about. But also, what does it actually mean that should be considered by a developer? How enforceable is that? What do they have to do if we did go down this path?
Yeah. Okay, so so I'm acknowledging your concern around the Our Place project. I mean, I think the thing to remember here is we're proposing to pilot 2 communities to do this, and we're going to come back to council with what that engagement program looks like. So it's not just about the residents who are living there, but we're able to engage with people who are both living there owning, living there renting, and any other demographic groups or interest groups that might have an interest in that particular part of the community. So put aside the name, the process which we will take back to council in the first half of the next financial year, the first quarter, will be signed off by council in terms of how we actually do the engagement. And this is principally to ensure that we have been inclusive as we possibly can. The idea of the Our Place vision is to, and you would have heard councillors, this idea of a plan that isn't done by, that's done by the community, not done to them. We've realised that the process of the spatial plan has created quite a polarised view on housing more broadly across the city. This type of process is used often to try to bring those 2 polarised elements to the middle ground and to create a vision statement for the future about their community to ensure that there is an element of done by the community, where the community's vision and aspirations for growth, how it sees growth to take, is represented in some way, and that can be used as a cue for development to occur in their community. And that's all it is. In this particular instance, the visions for mostly these 2 pilot areas first will be an agenda for a conversation with a developer. So quite often, and councillors don't see a lot of this, we have pre-application meetings with numerous developers across the city wanting to pitch a development, propose a development, explain the nuances of a site, and we, with the urban design units and the planners, sit down with the developer and coach them, if you like, before they lodge an application about what their development could do for the city or this particular community. This vision setting statement for our place is really just an opportunity to have an agenda for that conversation to occur. It doesn't have any statutory weight as such, but it will reference the design guidelines, which will have statutory weight and reference.
And in terms of pilot, what makes you think that the Newtown and Tawa should have their own as opposed to it being a citywide vision? Like, why is it broken down in a community way like that?
Well, Tawa is very different from Newtown, of course. I mean, I don't have to state the obvious, but the people in Tawa are... Yeah, absolutely. And Tawa's ripe for growth, and Tawa's going to transform. It's going to be a very, very different place in 10, 20 years. It may look like Tawa Main Street's a lot wider, but yeah, potentially it's going to have some interesting growth. It already is seeing quite markable live-work kind of developments, unit developments of scale happening there, as we say, as already. It also has 4 train stations, mind you. So it's actually absolutely ripe for growth. And we thought with Tawa that there is a requirement, that community is going to see a lot of change. So it's important that if we're going to pilot this idea, we pilot with a community who will see considerable change in density and in housing typologies changing. Newtown is different because Newtown have been very active and very pragmatic, engaging with officers, embracing growth, but they have a particular view on how growth should occur. So they're ready for a conversation. They're very interested in different housing types, but they're also very interested in protecting what makes Newtown special, and that was the reason why we chose those 2 pilot groups.
Kia ora. So, mine are just really questions around like whether I should move something as an amendment or whether it's just doable. So, can we have you know how we've got the green spaces map? Is there an opportunity to do one with like streams and stuff, given we don't really want people developing on or near streams? Like the Waikato, they've got that blue green, so can that just be done, or would that need to be an amendment?
Well, it would be pretty straightforward to include a map showing the blue network and all the streams.
Including the underground ones as well?
I think so. I think we have that. Yep.
Okay, cool. So that's all right. That's one thing that's off the list. With the SNAs, is there an opportunity to explore before the district plan an opportunity to provide rates rebates for people who have significant natural areas on their property, given they can't really do a lot with it, or like should I move it?
Short answer is yes. There's a number of councils across New Zealand that do afford some sort of rebate. Well, it depends if it's QE2, Queen Elizabeth Trust covenants. Often, yes, that they have a rebate scheme, a fencing scheme as well. They get rebates for fencing of these areas. These are urban SNAs. I'll defer to John. I'm pretty sure some of the staff are considering those types of incentives.
Yep.
So what's sort of considered as maybe a bid to go up as part of the LTP? It didn't quite make the cut, but certainly, if councillors wanted work done on that, we'd be happy to do some work on that.
I think the reason is because of and John would test this, we still are including SNAs into the district plan, so we're still having conversations with landowners about whether they would like their area included or not. National policy indicates it's kind of our job to lock those areas in, but we like to do it in a conversation with those property owners first, so they firstly understand the taonga they're sitting on, and that they know how to look after it, and then start to then build in the incentives. So we're not quite able to say we've got it all covered in the city at the moment. That work's still underway, but incentivising is definitely a tool we can use when we're really clear on what we will be protecting.
So can that be something that will be brought back to us?
It will be. It will be part of the district plan. I think it's more appropriate we deal with that through the SNA mechanism in the district plan and any of the incentive techniques we might use.
Okay. Just on the universities map, there's more than Massey and Vic in the city. There's Whitireia, Welltech, Toi Whakaari. Can they also be included in the maps? There's lots of tertiary institutions. Can they just be all added in there as well?
Yeah.
Can we? There's some transport maps in there. Do you think with this big investment in cycleways and stuff, can we do an active transport map by any chance of places that are really walkable and very cyclable? Like,
We can, but if you councillors recall, we were just about to have another crack at a master plan, so we left it out for the time being.
I just think this is a document that should be quite holistic and people can like look at it and
it should
see
be,
that,
yeah.
you know.
I think in this instance, councillor, we just decided that we're on the cusp of reviewing the cycle master plan, so we'd for this moment leave it
Until the
out
district plan.
until we've adopted the.
Okay. So what? So sorry, I'm just a bit unclear on what.
But
that's all.
happy to include the current cycleway master plan in there.
Okay. With the walking, just on the back of Jill's questions on the walking catchments, wouldn't it make more sense to like start with like, I don't know if there's any like accessible standard of how long it might. I know there's lots of different disabilities, but wouldn't, rather than taking like the amount of time a majority of people take to walk or cycle somewhere, wouldn't you take the kind of slowest so that it works for everybody? Like start from the kind of bottom up approach.
Yeah, no, I appreciate what you're saying there. We're currently working with community services to develop an accessibility model. The reason we started the way that we started was because in order to make the model accessible for people who are differently abled, for example, wheelchair users, it's a lot harder, creates a lot more work. You need to start including things like the height of a curb next to a road and a path. You need to include things like stairways, which I've already said are really, really difficult to model. So I do appreciate what you're saying, but we're working on it at the moment. So we're working very closely with community services, and we have an advisor who specialises in accessibility and how to navigate the city when you're differently abled. And that's going to be part of the update later on in the year.
So, okay.
So, sorry, I should specify that the walking network that we developed wasn't specifically for the Planning for Growth project. It's to be used by teams all across council. We were just the team that had the most urgent need for it, which is why we were the first team to use it. Okay. So the model itself will continuously be updated, especially with things like accessibility.
Okay, and then I just have two more. Can you, Liam, you were saying before that you were describing character as unique in Wellington, but can you describe to me how some of these areas are unique to Wellington? Because I just thought that there were like this kind of housing in Auckland and Dunedin, and like I just want to understand how specific.
Going to my happy place? No. Look, as a planner, as a professional urban planner, we this is sort of bread and butter stuff. So with Wellington, Wellington streets, the typology, how a city evolves is all reflected in the, when I say typology, both housing typology and the lots that are created in to house the lots, the lots that are created to put the houses onto, and that usually represents how cities have evolved over time. And so my description of Wellington's unique character is its topography and how its housing sit in the landscape. Also, the building materials the houses use are quite unique to Wellington, but also, to your point, unique to most of New Zealand, the native timber, the weatherboards, the roof pitches, the Victorian architecture, the Edwardian architecture, and of course then the pre-1930s or Art Deco architecture are quite common. But generally speaking, it's the nature of the city, its layout, its geography that dictates the type and flavour of the housing. So that's the place-based element to neighbourhood character. That's where people generally believe or understand that this is quite unique to the city. But I'm absolutely acknowledging the type of architecture, Victorian or otherwise, is very common in Auckland as well.
Yeah.
And but if you go to Dunedin, you see some of their Edwardian architecture or their Art Deco, they use a lot of brick, and it's all about resources close to the city, et cetera, et cetera. So you do get quite specific characteristics that cities capture and evolve over time that reflect that city's unique identity. And John's mentioned we have a number of well-known architects across Wellington whose current buildings have been protected because they're uniquely Wellington architects. So, and Athfield's a good example of that. So that's what I mean by unique character.
Okay, my very last one. What are the risks of, say we got enough votes to go back to the heritage protection as protected in the draft? What are the risks?
Well, there's no risks as such. I think I've provided some advice to one or two councillors in the last 48 hours saying would prefer you just to be very clear about what you decide to move if you have the numbers, to your point. The risks more relate to when we get to the plan making end in the district plan. So the people who you upset, and I need to say this quite clearly as well, I think to this degree we've upset everyone, and one of my planners said, well, you're probably doing your job then. You're not making everyone happy all of the time. That's not what planning's about. So, but I think the risks are for councillors to be absolutely clear. When you get to the district plan phase where we notify a proposed district plan, some of those old pre-1930 character areas have been removed. You may get appeals to the areas you removed. They'll look at the spatial plan process in that appeal process, and we'll just go in there and defend your decision effectively. But the risks are that because of the degree in which you're removing based on the draft spatial plan, it's subject to appeal. That's really the only risk. But to be fair, councillors, this thing's going to be appealed anyway on a number of matters, and we'll be in court for probably a number of years, whether it's hazard-related material or heritage-related material.
Can I just ask, in combining 4A and 4B, can you just give a very clear public statement now of how high the buildings will be? I'd like also the officers to move an amendment to clarify too, because it's got very unclear.
Yeah, just before Sherilyn and John introduce this, we'll talk to this in detail, I'll just introduce the concept. So we had quite a few submissions explaining they were confused by the typologies, in particular the transition between 4A and 4B types. And rightly or wrongly, officers tried to simplify the language and make it a bit clearer and drop a colour from the maps and just sharpen it up. But I think what's happened in their intent is that they've made things a little bit more murky. So I'll hopefully get Sherilyn and John to explain. It may be after discussions that we need to clarify a little further, Councillor, but we'll keep going.
Yeah, exactly, because there are a number of maps with that change, so yeah.
Okay, so as Liam has highlighted, what we were trying to do in our recommendations was simplify and the number of typologies and just help people understand, because we did get a lot of criticism that we had too many typologies and they were too complex. So what we decided to do was combine the 4A and the 4B categories, have one typology called enable 6 stories, but also have an overlay which sits on top of the 4A, type 4 typology that speaks to the MPS UD policy 3C areas, and so that overlay is the enable at least 6 stories. So yeah, I guess we were trying to make things clearer, but perhaps it has not had the effect we hoped for. One of the options might be to have 2 typologies to try and, make it clearer for people rather than the typology plus an overlay over top.
Sorry, so this actually hasn't helped. This was the critical element of this plan, obviously. So can you just explain how it differs across areas? Because some of my constituents will not want a 14-storey building in their neighbourhood, so they will have concerns, and there will be others in the suburban centres that may have similar concerns. And is there a limit? So if it's at least 6-storey, could it be 25? In theory? Probably wouldn't be economic, but just curious.
Well, yeah. So the spatial plan is it's not setting a minimum or a maximum. Enable 6 or at least 6 could be higher, but I guess the point is that the district plan will have specific rules and standards around building height for different locations across the city. So in the draft spatial plan, the type 4A, which I'm having brain blank, but I think it was...
It was up to 6 stories, and the 4B was at least, yeah.
Yep, so the type 4A up to 6 applied to suburban centre, sort of the key centre areas, and the type 4B, which was enable at least, was the basically the walkable catchments areas, so walkable catchments around Johnsonville Centre, the central city, and the rail stations. So in terms of our changes, the overlay that I was talking about, that is the walkable catchments areas, so that overlay applies to the walkable catchments within the central city, Johnsonville Centre, and the rail stations. Enable at least 6 within that overlay area, just like the 4B was trying to say. And the 4A is the enable up to 6. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So as a matter of public communication,
Yeah, I think so.
I don't think this is kind of...
We're either going to... So there doesn't sound like there's any practical change. It's just a name only. So it may be safe to revert... Name and colour. It might be safe to revert back to the original settings. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll...
So there's no actual
Councillor
practical
Paul
change.
and I will talk to you about public communication afterwards.
I think what we'd probably do is to make it, just get rid of the 4A and 4B and go 4 and 5 and 6. So it's too complicated, but I think we need to keep the same number of typologies because it gets confusing.
Okay, next question. In removing the overlay in the character areas, have you done calculations on how many extra people if they can go to from 3 to at least 6? Because, as you know, there'll be change in those areas anyway, as a matter of course, so it's just, have you added on the extra numbers, is what I want to know. I presume there will be extra people if it happens.
Yes, so we have had Becca's re-looking at the numbers as a result of our recommended changes, and there have been some losses, but there's also been some gains as well, depending on the area being looked at.
Sorry, so I just wanted a number. Have you, I mean, are you going to, do you think you can accommodate another 10,000 people or 5,000 people? Or maybe you could just
Take that question and we'll come back to you.
How about emailing?
Get Orla to look at that.
Okay, and then I did want to ask a question around how officers were looking at the spatial plan from an affordability and emissions. So it seems that there is a clear drive that this spatial plan is seen to be a way to create more affordable housing and lower emissions. But 16% of the growth of the whole region will come from the CBD and the inner suburbs. So there's 84% of the region that we need to think about in terms of emissions. And the affordability, for me, is there's quite some complexity there because, for example, I had a prominent developer telling me it's actually more expensive to build apartment buildings than townhouses. So could you just explain how you think those two things are working together, or will you try and address them through the district plan? And I have got some amendments to hopefully help with all this, but I just need to understand the relationship a bit better. Thank you.
So, I mean, this is all about your role in life, isn't it? Councils have a role. They're a regulator, they're a plan maker. When you look at the housing crisis and the housing affordability in particular in this city, it's a combination of market forces, central government regulation relating to buildings, particularly in Wellington because of the earthquake engineering required for some of them, And to your point, I think, Councillor, is the height of the buildings has considerable cost depending on the ground conditions for apartment developments. It has to do with material costs, and we've seen an escalation in some aspects of the materials market that have post-COVID that really skyrocketing. It has to do with labour costs, and then critically, of course, it has to do with supply. And that's our role. That's our role in life. It's supply. So as a regulator, it's trying to increase and upzone the city to ensure there's enough supply out there for the housing market to operate in a healthy way. But there are, as I've listed, other components to it. It's only part of the solution. By its very nature, Wellington is quite a compact city. And by its very nature, we have the best possible chance out of any city in New Zealand, in my opinion, to reach our carbon goals. And this plan is absolutely in line with that, in that we are encouraging intensification. We're encouraging intensification not only in the inner city, but around our villages and town centres. And in doing that, helped with, very, very helpfully, by the way, and with incredible amount of courage, an NPS that is transformative for all of our cities in New Zealand. It's not requiring car parking anymore for developments. It's trying to signal very, very clearly, both to local government and the market, that this is all about a walkable, low-carbon cities, and it's about dense and vibrant town centres. And this is an opportunity for this particular spatial plan, and indeed for the rule book, the district plan, for us to achieve that.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Condie. Fine, and we'll do Councillor Condie's questions, then we're going to have a 5-minute afternoon tea break. Okay. And then I knew we needed till 5 o'clock. We'll just try and just get, try and be as succinct as possible, all of us in our questions, and that would be awesome. Thank you.
Thanks. Just following up on Joel Day's questions about the MDRA and the Environment Court ruling, what it sounds like, and I'm not saying this is what you're saying, but what it sounds like from where I'm sitting is that you're essentially saying that the Environment Court ruling that happened, it doesn't apply to us now, even though nothing's changed. And so I'm really trying to understand why you think that the ruling that came out of the MDRA Environment Court that said these are not walking catchments, they're not walkable, is no longer relevant.
Yeah, I don't think I said that, Councillor. I think what I said was that that judge made a ruling based on the information the judge had before it at the time. I'm saying that we have new information, and in a new ruling, the judge may have a different opinion. So precedent has been set in that particular situation, but we know more than we knew then, and you need to be able to demonstrate in a court setting the evidence you have for a recommendation of this type. So I'm not discounting the fact that that set a precedent. I'm just saying that walking catchments are a very vague tool that we've built a lot of methodology around to allow us to recommend to you densities around particular train stations and town centres. It's a tool, it's a planning tool, and that's all it is. How a judge decides to take that as evidence or not is up to the judge.
Okay. In terms of ground truthing, you're saying we've got new evidence, which is this walking, which I assume is you're referring to the work you've done, modelling the walking pathways. In terms of ground truthing, that has staff visited sites and ground truth the model? In particular, I'm interested in the Johnsonville area and whether staff have been to ground truth any of the walking in the Johnsonville area, but also more generally across the city. Have we been out and actually walked these things to test out whether we think the model's any good?
So I'll speak to that. I suppose I can go into a bit more detail into the methodology that we used. So we initially began the review with a review of the literature. So we looked around all over the world to see what people were doing when it came to walking speeds. So this included looking at speeds for people who are elderly, people who are very young, all the way to using Strava data. So we conducted our literature review to get an idea of a starting point. Following that, we accessed Strava. So just in case anyone doesn't know, it's a fitness tracking app. So you can track your walks or your runs around the city, and it gives you GPS data and average speeds. So we accessed the Strava data for Wellington City to see what people were actually doing in terms of walking speeds and locations. Now, the caveat with Strava data is there's a certain type of person who uses it, and usually that person is very fit. But yeah, so we were aware that what we were getting from Strava was more people who are on the fitter end of the scale. It wasn't necessarily the average person. And I say this as a person who does not use Strava. So following that gave us, when we compared the research that we had done in the literature review, which gave us walking catchments, walking speeds, we compared that to Wellington-specific examples of walking speeds, applying the same caveat that people who use this particular application are going to walk faster than the average person. We then used staff from Wellington City Council to carry out walks in their local area. So we do have staff who live all over Wellington, including Johnsonville. And they went out with this walking application and they recorded their walks and they recorded their speeds. And we applied that analysis to our own research. So we said, here's what the global research is telling us. Here's what people who track their movements in Wellington tell us. And then here's what individuals who walk every day or walk to and from work is telling us. So in terms of ground truthing, we're still working on that, but we do have staff who have tested it in their own time. So we have staff members who live in Johnsonville, and one of them at the time had a wife who was heavily pregnant, and she tested some of our walking catchments. And you know, they were able to tell us that, yeah, 10 minutes was a realistic catchment. Now, they did also say that that depended on the day and depended on the mood and all of those variables. But when we talk about averages, so the walking catchments are generated for two groups of people, as I mentioned in my previous presentation. So we had people who we considered low walkers and people who we considered moderate walkers. We generated the catchment for these two groups of people individually, and then we got the average of that. So we did try to include as many people as possible. So that includes people who are very elderly, who possibly walk with mobility aid, all the way to people who are relatively fit and active and walk every single day. Unfortunately, it doesn't include the people who are power walkers or run marathons every day. So that's how we captured the evidence and how we did our ground truthing. We still need to do more robust ground truthing, but we're pretty confident that what we have is very accurate.
And just to add, Councillor, I mean, this is it's been a great piece of work by all his team, and it's been recognised by the region because Hutt's considering using it, Porirua is considering using it, and Kapiti.
So Upper Hutt City Council have already applied our methodology. We're working with Kapiti and Porirua to help them apply it, and we're also working with Greater Wellington Regional Council and NZTA to help them adapt our methodology as well.
Thank you. My final question is about qualifying matters under the MPS. So we've got these character precincts that we've set, that we've got this evidence base, and we say that based on this evidence base, we think that these areas are a qualifying matter under the MPS. Does the MPS says that we can exempt areas that are subject to a qualifying matter? It doesn't say that we have to. Can you just sort of unpack that? Because I think we've clearly got evidence that on the basis of the evidence, what you've proposed is that we could exempt all of these character precincts under the MPS. But yeah.
Yeah. So the MPS allows councils to to not apply the intensification requirements where they think that they have evidence to take a different approach. So that is that's our character precincts that we're putting forward. We think there's an evidence base to justify those areas as a qualifying matter. It has to be tested through the district plan, of course, but yeah, the buffer assessment would seem to meet the NPS UD's requirement for a site-by-site assessment.
We've so we talked with MFE about this, and they confirmed that in their view that qualifies. And we've also had it checked by our legal team in terms of its compliance with NPS, and they raised no concerns.
But can you then just confirm that this means that we've got enough, if we believe we've got enough evidence that we can exempt it, not that we have to?
Exactly. That's right.
And then we will resume. Thank you very much. Questions, Deputy Mayor Free, then the Mayor.
Was the Mayor first, actually, but I don't mind going. Right, so my questions, I've just got a couple, and they're really relating to this transport map. So I noticed not all the bus routes are on it, just some. Who? Are we waiting for Liam, are we? So through the chair, this is just about the transport maps and the bus routes, and how were these bus routes chosen to be on this map? Because are they the high frequency bus routes? There are a few probably that I'm missing, but can you please just...
Yeah, so the bus routes that we are showing on the transport maps refer to the high frequency bus routes, and that's as defined by Greater Wellington. So they look at how frequent the bus comes, and they also look at the number of passengers that they carry. So they're the key high frequency bus routes, yeah.
And I guess that we're not very much in control of the services, but are we working in partnership with Greater Wellington to try and understand whether they're going to have the capacity? Like, how is the spatial plan going to be responded to by Greater Wellington? Can they respond to it? And not just the...
I can try to give that a go. So, so let's pop up back to the region. So we're Wellington City Council's helping the region to a large degree, actually, with a housing and business assessment analysis. We also have a strategic land supply program where we're again providing GIS and demographic advice to the region about how it grows. That's all feeding into what we call the Regional Growth Framework. And the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee that's just been established, their task is to oversee, in a spatial sense, just like this is for Wellington City Council, a spatial plan for the region, and we're really looking forward to working with them on that. And that's, that picks up, to your point, Deputy Mayor, the transport network more broadly. And in that relationship and in the work we're doing with them and quite closely with them, they're also feeding into our transport planning function, and we vice versa as well. So we're quite tightly aligned on now, particularly on where the cities plan to grow, and they're lockstep with us. I think the mention earlier before with Stebbings in the Lincolnshire Farm area, we've had sessions on expanding the bus networks through those growth areas over time. The the Petone to Nauranga cycleway is a good example, and also the Porirua to Petone east-west link, which is a key part of the regional growth framework, is another example of where both road and public transport connections are going to be critical for the region and for the city to operate as effectively as it can. So I'm really confident that we're working well with the Regional Council. We do acknowledge that they hold the transport mandate. They run particularly the public transport network, and so through our transport planning team, they work very closely with them as networks change and evolve over time.
At one point, they had an aspiration. It's articulated in the 2014 Regional Public Transport Plan to have 75% of the region's population living within a 15-minute walk of a high-frequency bus route or train route. Is that still current aspiration, or has there been anything to replace that measure?
Yes, I believe it is. I think I'll get Orla to come and talk to that.
Yes, so without going into too much detail, because I don't have a full understanding of the background, we were speaking to Greater Wellington just last week around how they were going to evaluate a walking catchment. So I believe that would feed into their plan. So we're working with them on how to calculate a walking catchment around railway stations, but that's all I spoke to them about, so I don't have a full understanding of their plan.
So remembering that 70% of our population catch buses, can we also make sure they don't forget about people who have to catch a bus? Yeah, we will. Thank you. And my last question is just about demographics again and ageing population. So how much have we thought about the needs of an ageing population in relation to what we're planning in the spatial plan? And I guess that goes to accessible housing, and how much would we need, and have we got enough? And rest times, have we got enough?
I guess as John was saying before, considering the range of different needs that people are going to have across all age groups has been a key consideration and, forms part of the proposals. And the whole idea of a compact city that's well connected by lots of different ways of getting around and, getting to and from key things like the hospital, it's all been a key consideration for our plans here in the spatial plan. Do you want to
Just, and again, just encouraging or enabling a range of different housing across the whole of the city. Medium density is a good example around existing suburban centres. So with that, people, I know from my own experience, my neighbours who were looking for a long time for a house in Island Bay, but there was they wanted to downsize, they wanted to live in a sort of a multi-unit, a townhouse type thing. Nothing available. But, this certainly gives the opportunity for that sort of thing to happen.
Look, I guess I'd just like to see the demographic data because I do want to know where it's going in terms of age brackets. And the other thing is too, can we have the aspiration from the regional councillor in relation to the walkable catchments? What are they actually aspiring to? Do they still hold true to that 75% of the city would live within 15 minutes of a high frequency transport route? Because that was the stated aspiration in 2014, but I haven't seen any update or any reference to it since then. So I'm worried we don't have anything to actually stick to measure by.
We'll follow that up for sure, Deputy Mayor. I think what I can share with you is some draft projections. As John's pointed out, Sherilyn's indicating, we're trying to understand. We know from our housing studies where we have a deficit, and clearly there's a growth in 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, and that's been happening for quite some time. You could argue with the demographic profile. I'll just quickly run past you now that we're going to need more of those over time. So the key point for our future demographic profile is that look, we've got a falling birth rate. We've got an ageing population, and we've got a continued inward migration of people. So that's inward migration as Wellington is continuing to attract people, and it's mostly related to employment, but also lifestyle, I'd suggest. And with falling immigration rates, and it's been in the news recently as well, this is probably the biggest unknown, and Chris Farfoy made a statement several months ago that they are revisiting the migration policy, so we have to sort of be conscious of that, which again is why I think it's important we review this plan in 3 years. But with regards to age rates and population growth, the rates of population growth are highest at ages of 50 and over, so that's this ageing population. We've got a continuation of that over the long term. And this baby boomer bubble is proceeding down the demographic. We've got a share of a population over 70 that's going to rise significantly over the next 30 years. And I think, Deputy Mayor, to your point, and to ingest, I'm sure, Councillor Rush, but we will see more and more demand for housing that appropriately caters for the elderly. And that's going to challenge our brownfield sites more particularly because there isn't a lot of greenfield opportunities for those areas to happen. So we're going to see some very interesting developments in and around the city that are dealing and managing this fastest growing demographic.
It's a good way to free up some of those older, bigger houses for new families too.
Yep. So the growth in the households that was mentioned, and this is more broadly about the age composition of the population. So we're still going to see household growth as these demographic cohorts grow, but the increasing numbers of people living in smaller households will be probably seen. Non-private residents, as I said, not aged care facilities is a good example, and these smaller households are really where families are heading. Families are very diverse now. What is a family these days? The definition is very, very fluid. So that will have a demonstrable impact on the type of housing we're building, and I think the spatial plan with its encouragement of higher densities, will allow the market to hopefully innovate and provide for those changing demographics.
Thanks, and first of all, just say congratulations on the Our Place, because I do think that's a really great initiative. I just wish we'd started it earlier, but I think it'll be really good to see that happen. Questions. First question, sort of around economics of development. So you sort of partially answered that question. I think it was either Fleur or Rebecca's question, but it's just the prospective levels of development under the new planning rules and the degree to which that varies across the city. Now, you said that some areas are going to be more difficult to intensify, you know, the small section areas. But I'm interested in just what the economics of it are, that somebody would go, right, I'm going to take, because by and large it means you've got to take out something that's there and put something back in place. So what are the economics of that between different parts of the city? What information do we have about that? And that goes to that capacity, 14%, 29%, whatever the numbers are. And the second part of that is the economics of the 6 stories. I'd be really interested in seeing some information of substance from MFE as to why they landed on 6 stories and whether 6 stories is more economic than 4 or 8, which is, by my understanding, 6 isn't brilliant, but if you could give us something about that. And if they've just pronounced it, that would be interesting too. And the last part about the economics is that car parking. Of what information you've got. You said it made it more conservative, made it easier, John. But if you've got anything that actually says this makes it easier to any given degree, that would be interesting as well. In other words, we start putting some numbers around those. That's the first area of questions.
We'll have a go at that, Your Worship. It's the series of difficult questions. Firstly, the economics are very, very high level at this stage. We haven't modelled, because this isn't at the rule book stage. That's really a Section 32 kind of analysis when we understand the implications and rules on the market and the economics of development. But my point earlier about realisable development, that 14% in those established inner city suburban areas, it relates specifically to how the lot typologies of those communities are distributed. Of course, the value of those lots is also very, very high, and if you can carefully design 2 units on a 300 square metre block that meets all the daylighting and wellbeing matters that any development needs to meet, then no doubt you're going to, you know, probably make a reasonable profit on that development. The scale going out to more larger outer suburbs with larger blocks, we know that just from the material we actually presented to you in the last workshop, the distribution of unit developments across the city is quite even. So we're seeing areas in the north of the city and in the south of the city and in the inner city, there's an equal distribution of development, both in subdivision and building unit developments. Slight preference to the larger outer suburb areas, but Jenny's shaking her head saying, I'm understating that. Well, I think it's 8 to 10% variance, but the pie chart looks reasonably evenly spread. There's no sort of unequal distribution from memory. I could always bring that up again and have a look at it. But John, do you have anything more to add on the economics of the fact? I mean, the only thing I'd add about the car parking, just as an anecdotal example only, because we don't have any analysis on the car parking removal, but we know it will incentivise growth, particularly in the inner and outer suburban areas. But as an example, we had a tour of an apartment complex last week with staff, and you can, with your apartment, for an additional $100,000, buy a car park. So you can choose to buy an apartment without one, or if you want to
unbundling it makes a lot of sense.
Well, I mean, this is what the market's driving. So as a result of car parking is now not compulsory, right? So people can provide it as they see fit, but developers are now looking at it as a commodity and selling it on top of an apartment development.
Okay, second area of question is just around some of the changes to the existing planning rules, and two that I wanted to ask you about there were the reversing the protections that we put in place several years ago around infill, out of scope, out of character, etc. Privacy impacts. This is the Plan Change 56. So I'm interested in what analysis you've done about how you can offset the adverse impacts of doing that, because obviously it had an adverse impact, which is why we did it in the first place. And the second one is now I think I understand is in the central city, and that includes Te Ara, you're basically saying no height limits at all is just what your thinking is around that in terms of, again, the adverse impacts, potential adverse impacts, height, wind, shading, all those sort of things, and the high city, low city model, which we've had forever, is going, oh, we'll change that. So what you're thinking is about those impacts of those two changes. And then I've got one more.
So yeah, as I understand, so your reference is to the infill height limit.
It's particularly height because that goes to privacy and shading and all those sort of things and character.
Yeah, so obviously it's a district plan consideration, but does signal if there is a decision to move on that does impact capacity and yield across the city. But I suppose what the view, we've done some research and actually tested, I suppose, the impact of the current infill height limit, which is 4 metres and 6 metres, depending on topography. Essentially, as you say, to limit I suppose, some bad outcomes that were happening, particularly in the areas like Miramar. So Plan Change 56 was to address that. I suppose we're looking at that again because that's quite a limitation on development at the moment, but trying to also manage those neighbour-to-neighbour conflicts that you referenced. So what we're looking at is how we would enable more density, potentially more height, but better manage those neighbour-to-neighbour issues.
So that was my question, was the how, because it was a real problem that we got a whole lot of grief from all over the city about pretty crap developments, to be blunt, which were really adversely affecting people and neighbourhoods, and they didn't like it, which is why we moved on it. So my question is really, how are you going to make sure, if you're going to free that up again, you actually don't have put us back in exactly the same position we were 10, 12 years ago?
So I think Tim Johnson gave you a bit of councillors gave you a briefing on that particular issue. So one of the provisions we're looking at is a separation distance between
6 metres.
Of 6 metres, yes, and outdoor living space requirements. But also you'll recall the MPS is really driving us towards enabling more capacity and development across the city. So that has to be the amenities, I suppose, currently enjoyed by certain neighbours and enabled by the district plan has to be carefully looked at. And so it is a balancing act around sort of getting more development, but also managing those neighbour-to-neighbour issues.
It does feel like a race to the bottom. What about the central city?
And the central city, so you mentioned TRO and height limits. So again, the MPS is driving us to essentially saying no height limits. So that was actually a very challenging position for us. We have a very, and we have to come to you councillors around this as part of district plan, but there's a lot of nuanced height limits all across the city at the moment, some of them justified and some of them not. But of course we will have the qualifying matters to apply across, so the view shafts and the open space and the areas of natural hazards and Thorn and Key, etc. Sorry, and heritage, of course, that's a big one, and the waterfront. So it's not carte blanche right across the city. So, and one of the things we're looking at, particularly in places like Tiara, is does there need to be sort of like a enable height up to say maybe 4 stories, and then stepped back. So you have a stepping back effect to ensure that you get sunlight and daylight and into those streets, particularly the real narrow ones, and to avoid those wind tunnel effects and that canyon effect that you could potentially get if you had unlimited heights.
Because the document at the moment doesn't actually talk about that kind of thing. It just says would it be helpful actually to include that kind of concept if that's what your intention is? Because otherwise, if you read the spatial plan alone without knowing there's a district, without thinking there's a district plan which might say something slightly different, it'd be helpful to at least guide the district plan, which is what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, I think it doesn't get into specifics around what the controls would be, but it talks about managing the bulk and form of development buildings in TRO, particularly where there are narrower streets. So, do
you think sometimes it gets too nuanced?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Maybe we can do something about that. And look, the last one is in the opportunity areas. Is the Miramar opportunity site, which I see's got itself in there. would it be helpful to actually say, look, with the intention with that site, but given its significance, and I know it's a special amenity landscape, that we actually specify that we will actually do some sort of an engagement process with stakeholders and with the community around that? Because at the moment it says nothing. It says nothing and it says everything, but it doesn't. It gives you absolutely no comfort or certainty at all about anything that might happen there, or where the balance might lie, which makes the spatial plan completely useless in that. It's in there in 2 or 3 places. But
I suppose the point. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, that's again potentially a detail for the district plan, but the idea of those opportunity areas is that outside of the default settings in the spatial plan, there's opportunities to increase supply. And at this stage, I don't believe, for example, the opportunity area in Miramar is part of our calculations necessarily. Until we see the developments emerge, at the moment we're just saying it's an opportunity for more dwellings.
Is that what we're saying? Because it kind of
it's an opportunity for development. Most of those sites do include dwellings, but also commercial retail, for example, in Johnsonville.
I'm talking about the top of the Miramar Hill.
Yeah, I believe you're referring to the Mount Crawford prison site. Is that right?
Well, it's the moment because at the moment it's all zoned open space B, which means nothing, and it's there as a special amenity landscape, which would tend to suggest nothing. If you think it's a housing site, what's the process that we're planning on going through?
It's more likely the latter, because of the current zoning and the nature of the peninsula. I.e., it's more of a green open space area than a housing development in that particular instance.
So why?
But in Strathmore and Johnsonville,
I'm very cool with that. So why don't we say that? Because it's not what it says at the moment.
So maybe if I could help. So what we're currently saying is what is anticipated, work with Taranaki whānui, central government agencies, etc., and landowners to understand the values and aspirations held for the area and the opportunities these present to the local area and wider city. Encourage future development of Watts Peninsula to be informed by a master plan process. To ensure a coordinated and design-led approach to delivery of development and supporting infrastructure. And thirdly, introduce controls to protect the historic and cultural values of the peninsula and identified SNAs as part of the district plan review process.
Could you guide us, so final part of that, could you guide us as to who gets to be involved in the master plan process?
I think normally we always engaging with the master plan process, we're always engaging with the people that the master plan applies to. So what that process looks like, I've got no idea, but generally speaking, on a subject of that scale or a site of that scale, we'll be absolutely having community involvement, and so will places.
So you have no difficulty saying that?
I will have no difficulty saying that. Yeah, master planning process generally involves all of the stakeholders.
Thank you.
Could we add recreational and open space values to that? Because, at the moment, that is a really important part of it.
I think the points John just read out included that, Deputy Mayor. John, do you want to just quickly repeat?
It's about special natural areas. That's the only thing that referred to the open space.
Just the Deputy Mayor's querying whether we can add another. Can you just read those points on the Miramar opportunity?
So the first one is around working with Taranaki whānui, etc. Encourage future development through a master planning process. And thirdly, introduce controls to protect the historic and cultural values of the peninsula and identified its significant natural areas as part of the district plan.
There about the open space or recreational values, which are quite immense.
Okay.
Ka pai, Deputy Mayor. Done. We'll include that.
So I have a miscellany of questions. So the first one is, if in theory we decided we would only build on brown sites, how much capacity would that deliver us in the city? And brown sites, I include things like all those car yards in Kent Terrace and...
We can get that figure. That's in a city, just to be clear?
No, including generally, because it just seems to me that that there's a huge battle looming in Wellington already underway, and actually the problem could easily be solved by just going to the brown sites.
Brownfield sites, yeah. You just have to be cautious there.
Can answer that.
Yeah.
Always cautious, but it's just a theory.
Yep. So we're just doing a quick calculation just to give you a ballpark figure on that.
Okay, so while you're doing that...
Well, I can actually answer that now if you like.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So currently we're 22,000, almost 23,000 to 30,000 dwellings. That includes greenfield, minus, so if you took out the greenfield, that's 2,000 less than that. So it'd be around about 21,000 to 28,000. So greenfield across, doesn't have a major impact on the overall growth numbers.
I'm just not quite sure what you're telling us. You're saying that brownfield sites would deliver that number of houses?
Yes.
23.
It depends what you mean when you say brownfield.
I think we'd need for that figure. Sorry, Madam Chair. Yeah, for that figure, council would probably have to do a bit more analysis. But the figures John just read out related to just dropping out Upper Stebbings and Lancashire Farm and giving you a sense more broadly around the inner city centre areas. But I think what you're referring to is the inner city and the extended area to Adelaide Road, the brownfield sites that are currently perceived to be underutilised or under-optimised from a housing point of view. That would need some, so that's a bigger question, John, so we'd have to take that on notice. I think that I just caution thinking like that because this goes back to my earlier point around the realisable value or the uptake rate assumptions for those areas. And I think Councillor Rush just made a comment there. I mean, these, particularly the car yards, are actually very high employment hubs. They have quite a few people working and servicing in a service industry sense and have quite considerable jobs in that space. And, successful businesses, frankly, and the desire for them to move quickly and decamp and go somewhere else and then upzone to housing. That's really a call they need to make. So that's why that goes back to the comment I made earlier about the uptake rate assumptions. This is why we do the percentage assumptions.
I can see that, but if you go to New York, you don't expect to see car yards in Fifth Avenue. And if you're in central London, I lived in central London, there are no petrol stations in central London.
Yeah, I totally agree. New York and London have several hundred, if not thousands of years, certainly in London's case, of evolution than the city of Wellington does. But I do believe, and I think the point you're making, Councillor Young, is that more than likely within, whether it's this decade or the next, those sites will find a new home and they will be upzoned, but it's entirely up to the owner and the.
Okay, so the next one is just thinking of, for example, Newtown and Mount Victoria, where both community organisations have put a lot of work into coming up to an alternative plan. Has any serious consideration been given to those? Because, again, I speak as someone who is, of course, I know everything because I'm a councillor, but I'm also totally ignorant. It just seems to me that they really know their suburbs and have done their utmost to come up with a viable solution that answers everyone's needs.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor. So it's two parts to that question. I'll try to answer. The first is, again, I'll refer you back to the what's realisable, and I'm aware of the work that they've done, and I'm aware how detailed and professional the material is. But again, our role, to take you back to my earlier point, is in the supply role. We're trying to provide the market with the right conditions to achieve the outcomes we want from a housing affordability point of view, and to pinpoint, if you like, or individually select sites for, hey, that's a great place to growth, is not real in the sense of my realisable uptake rate. It's just not. It's not a real consideration, because as planners and as regulators, we need to provide a fair and balanced enablement upzone. So the other point I'd make is, a little bit sitting in the Our Place program, that over time we hope to sit down with Tawa and the Newtown community to pilot these ideas of where the district plan might be able to take cues from, where their vision for their community is heading and going. But that vision just relates to the type of place they would want. It's not specific to sites. It's not specific to brownfield sites in those particular areas. It's just a high-level vision around what is it this current community and the future community may or may not value as part of their development.
So would you say that those communities have wasted their time?
No, not at all. I think the feedback I've given to that particular group you're referring to is that it's the work, the empirical analysis and the evidence they're producing the work would be best at a district plan level during submission process.
Okay, thank you for that. So the next question is the no height limits in the CBD, which frankly I find terrifying, knowing how suboptimal most of the land in the CBD is because it's marshy or it's high quake, etc. Now, I do know that you can build anything, as they've proved in cities like Hong Kong and Japan, but I mean, it just seems to me that it's putting the fear of God up people, to be honest, because of things like sunlight, because of wind effects, because of the effects on cyclists, which have been a real problem in the City of London with some of those big buildings, that the wind factor has become so extreme that people are being, for example, blown off their bicycles. I know Wellingtonian cyclists are a particularly staunch breed, but we don't want to test it too much, do we? I'm not an engineer. I mean, it's just like, I mean, in London they've got one that's 305 stories high. I mean, that would be a bit of a shocker in Wellington. It would probably be untenanted, of course. The Wodge. No, meters, not stories. Meters. I can't read my writing, that's the problem.
The trees coming up the sides, I've seen those as well. That's what we need to do.
So the thing is, do you think we should? I mean, like, I accept that the Paddington and the other one, is not an ideal scenario for all sorts of reasons, not just height. But do you think we should say, like, this will be the desired kind of range, but to say no height limit? I mean, I know we have great engineers, but really no height limit?
Well, again, we have to have a pretty good reason against the national policy statement. We have to have a pretty good reason to set a height limit, and there may be reasons in some, like we're proposing as officers to present to you that Thornton Quay is not a place where we should have unlimited height, and that the existing height control should still apply because of natural hazards reasons. And as I mentioned, those other matters are considerations as part of all of that. So the qualifying matters, sort of natural hazards and heritage and those sorts of things. There's also a market dynamic here. So, like we spoke to a developer just recently, the costs of construction are such that they are looking seriously at whether they'd even take advantage of going higher. They're looking
higher than what?
Higher than they currently do, even.
So is there a maximum at the moment?
Yes, there's a maximum at the moment. So we often hear from developers that the district plan is a restriction on their development aspirations. It's not always the case. Sometimes it is. We do have all those necessary other controls in place, like wind protection. That still applies. So I don't think it's going to be everything going up. I think it'll depend on the particular circumstances of the site, how big the site is. And as you alluded to, a lot of the central city has not good ground conditions, so it costs a lot to come out of the ground. And so sometimes developers will make a call that maybe I have a smaller development and I might make more money that way than going and having a big development.
I guess the thing is people don't always have confidence in the council because we haven't always got it right. I'm happy to explain it. Just checking you're listening. So the last one I'd say is just about the car parks, which are no longer necessary, and that's great. I know how much extra it costs to have a car park in an apartment. I think some apartment blocks it's more than 100,000, but in apartment blocks where it's not 100,000 for a car park, what I'm just thinking about, something which I hadn't thought until I went to see some of the social housing, is a lot of people have occupations that require them to have cars, and these are often lower income occupations, like taxi drivers, for example. So are we really legislating against them by saying you don't have to have a car park? Yeah,
it's now a choice. So a developer, well, we're not requiring, but they might choose to. So they'll have to go through a consenting process, and then people make decisions about where they buy and sell. So, you know, there's a whole range of things that go on. It's just that we're not requiring it.
Okay.
Because we can't, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Councillor Calvert, you there? Is she there? Okay. Diane, can you hear us? Okay. No? Ah, there we go. No? Can you unmute her?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah,
thank you.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. Apologies for not being there, but as you know, I'm a bit immobile at the moment. So, So look, I have got a number of questions, but I'll just keep it to three. We talk about infrastructure, and in particular, water infrastructure, about being important to enable growth. But there's no mention of electricity infrastructure, and we've been hearing a number of anecdotal comments that electricity infrastructure is in need to increase, not only for the growth of people, but also as we electrify our transport fleet, and as the number of homes shift from natural gas heating to electricity heating. So I'm just wondering whether officers could comment about why there's no reference to electricity infrastructure in the spatial plan.
I'll have an attempt. It's something that we as council have very little control over, but we have been talking to Wellington Electricity as part of our spatial plan conversations. So about, you know, future growth and what the spatial plan is trying to do in terms of planning for future growth, what that looks like and where it might take place. And that is to help Wellington Electricity plan for future networks and network upgrades. And I guess they're not only looking at us in Wellington City, they're looking across the whole of their region where they supply electricity to. But anyone else want to?
I'd only add that I think I made this point earlier in a previous briefing, is that when we started engaging with Wellington Electricity, they were grateful that the first someone was considering growth and considering what a spatial plan for the city is, and they were also grateful of being involved in the growth area work, the regional growth framework, and they described themselves and their role in that as fast followers. So they're following us fast in how they're going to plan their network based on the development settings and the spatial plan being recommended.
Yeah, but I mean, I would have thought we've got a role, an advocating role, and we need to ensure that all the infrastructure is lined up, whether we own it or not, or control it or not. So I'm just thinking that we are, you know, we're being very passive, and I just wondered whether you can be a bit less passive in terms of electricity infrastructure, because it's really important for our growth. Yeah, I think, isn't it? I mean, are you saying
I
then?
Describe our role as passive. No, I think this is to my point that they're very grateful that we've moved into the space at this level and at this altitude, and that's what they're telling us. Now that we have some direction and confidence, we can advise our board how to plan our network better and make the improvements we need to make.
So is there some reference that could be made to electricity infrastructure in the spatial plan?
So as part of the amendments we're recommending, particularly at the implementation and action plan end of the spatial plan, we've added more reference to all of the infrastructure providers, including Wellington Electricity, and there's also a specific action added to the action plan now that speaks to council working closely with all of the infrastructure providers to deliver this plan. So
okay, so it sounds like ongoing. I might need to. But there's no amendment to put it in to reference it within the spatial plan, other than the implementation or action plan.
That's where the main reference is. There are other references within the spatial plan text itself to the broader infrastructure requirements. So not just the stuff that council is responsible for, but across everything else, including electricity.
All right, that's fine. The second point is there was a lot of mixed feedback about the engagement leading up to the draft spatial plan, and I know a number of people didn't get to see it until near the end of the consultation period. What plans has the council got on communicating what is decided around the spatial plan? And I talk about communicating to residents, saying, because we've only had a limited amount of time from this document coming out to us now discussing it, only a week. So what plans does the council have on communicating what's been decided?
Hi, Councillor Calvert. Sorry, I haven't got my plan in front of me, but we have got a really extensive action plan, a stakeholder action plan to communicate with all the various stakeholders we've already sent some out to the Planning for Growth, to all our resident associations. We've got, and from when we actually finalise or we get to the final stage, we'll also be going out again with more communications. So we've broken down into all our key stakeholders, and we'll be sending out newsletters and communications at that time. Our website has been updated. Okay, so is there any plans to communicate using our rating database and our email databases, and letting everyone know about what's been decided and where they can go to for further information? Not at this stage. We are planning to contact all our everyone who put in a submission. That was 3,000 people. What about the 70,000 rating units? Or 80,000, however many we've got? Sorry, I'm just going to look at this. No, we hadn't planned to go out to every resident, but we are going to use media releases and lots of other methods to get out to the various stakeholders. I would have thought a simple way would have been sending a letter out, but that's not on the plan then, by all accounts? Not at this stage. Okay, maybe we can look at doing something like that. And my third one is... Councillor, we'll advise you about that later. I'm just getting some advice that whether we can actually use that database in that way, but I'll advise via email to all the councillors. I would say, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, but I can't see why you can't use the rating database with names and addresses on to send a communication, even if you include it in the next rating notice. Yes, it seems very simple, doesn't it? But I will advise in an email later. Well, I know other councils do it. So anyway, and my third question for now is I will focus on the Johnsonville railway line. And there's been a couple of comments. Somebody's made a comment about we're going to enable heights over 6 meters for Johnsonville and any railway stops. What do you mean by railway stops?
It means a station.
A station. Does that not mean a rapid transit stop? Because under the MPS, it's rapid transit stop, not just a railway station stop.
Can we just take that question on notice, Councillor? We'll be back to you. Maybe take another question and we'll get back to you.
That would be good. So what I would also, as part of that, can you provide written information that you've received from any source, any government agency, MFE, or Greater Wellington Regional Council, defining that the Johnsonville line is a rapid transit line, and also what stops they've defined as rapid transit stops?
Yeah, we'll take that question on notice and get back to you, Councillor.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Sparrow.
Just on that last one, I was going to ask something along those lines, and I see that just in the last few minutes we've had there's a letter come through to do with the whole business of rapid transit on the Johnsonville line, although the whole thing sounds like a bit of an oxymoron. But yeah, so that needs to be looked at. So I won't pursue that one further, but my question was going to be whether I think this directive was under the central government rather than council about rapid transit here, and whether this is sort of determined by those in ivory towers rather than actually people specifically looking at the Johnsonville line in terms of whether it is in reality rapid transit, because one would suggest it's not. But maybe they just think any train service is automatically rapid transit, which you could argue that the Kapiti line, the Waikanae line is rapid transit, but not the Johnsonville one. But
Sure. Thanks for your question, Councillor. Would it be helpful for Council to allow Andrew just to walk you through officers' thinking in regards to the Johnsonville line? And indeed the policy settings at the regional and central government level.
Here we go.
yes, yeah. Proceed.
It's a naughty line.
Okay, thanks, councillors. I'll try and keep it brief. So the MPSUD does direct intensification within walkable catchments of the rapid transit stops, and that is a place where you enter and exit a rapid transit service, which is any frequent, quick, reliable, high-capacity public transport service that operates on a permanent route, road or rail. So then the question was, well, what's included in that? And since that came out, we've had three sources of input. One is the MFE guidance, which has said that all stations on Wellington commuter rail services are rapid transit stops, and that's also been confirmed in our discussions with MFE. We've also had the Regional Land Transport Plan, which identifies the Wellington region's rapid transit corridors, and they have included the Johnsonville line in that. And the other was the One Network Framework, which is a new way of categorising transport corridors, road and rail, and including a lot of place and movement. It's a pretty cool thing. But the main thing relevant here is that rail corridors that are dedicated rail corridors are automatically defined in that rapid transit category, presumably on the grounds that you can actually improve the services in there over time. So none of those are absolutely definitive in terms of a legal requirement, but they are a nice set of guidance for us to use in defining what is rapid transit. It's also fed into looking at more broadly at some of the amenity and services around these stops, and whether people can use them to access jobs and amenities and services and schools, etc. So that's the main reason why it's currently under the rapid transit line, Johnsonville line.
Yeah, two quick further questions on page both 27 and 42. It talks about agree to pilot the Our Place project with 2 communities over the next 6 months. So this is referred to twice. Have those 2 communities been defined? Are they Tawa and Newtown, or have we defined those yet?
Yes, they've been defined as pilots, Tara and Newtown, but this is subject to a council decision. Yeah.
Thank you. And the other one is just on page 33. It talks about the walking catchment. This is to do with Kinapuru Station. Extends into the residential area. It says north of Linden. Should that be of North Linden, because any residential area north of Linden is into Pairua. So, right.
Love how succinct you are. Thank you. Right, Councillor Rush.
So I'm not going to push you on the legal nuances that have just come through, but they do seem to raise some issues of process. So I'll let Beth have a look at that. But that was, I mean, my colleagues have actually asked most of my questions. I guess, Liam, for you really, and as we discussed earlier, I am a bit concerned about the infrastructure gaps that you mentioned. We will plug them in the next LTP, but we're sanctioning higher density construction in advance of that, so we're going to end up with an infrastructure deficit, which is the number one thing I said I would never allow it to happen. This is part of also is, Kiwi Rail's not announced any sort of upgrade to the Johnsonville line, or in Wellington electricity hasn't. I know they're doing some work in the CBD, but some of these other growth areas, what needs to be done, don't really have a feel for that. And I also wonder whether. Yeah, I mean, I won't get into the electricity renewables thing at this stage, but can you just maybe just touch on those issues, on how you see us ensuring we don't fall behind on the infrastructure as construction starts evolving prior to us getting an understanding about what we need?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. So I've made some statements earlier on about the fact that this particular spatial plan has allowed us to get to an elevation that gets a snapshot of where the city's current state's at. And the LTP you've just adopted has approved some pragmatic, practical works in some of these more ready growth areas that are more ready for development. And it's also funded quite a considerable amount in actually discovering what we don't know. And over the next 3 years, in particular Wellington Water, we're looking forward to them doing that discovery piece and reporting back to Council in 2024's LTP to tell you where the gaps are, or to tell you and instruct you where they think investment's required based on the spatial plan settings. The comment around development, we're talking, just as an example, I think it's a practical one, we're talking about a development proposal at the Adelaide Road end of town, and the developer has just secured the site, showing us some designs, and his projected timeline for growth is, for actually getting diggers on the ground and doing the foundation works, is 3 to 4 years away. So in 3 years, we'll have a much better picture of the city. The incremental growth of a city means that things happen, but happen in a reasonably slow pace for whatever reason. So I can't imagine the next 3 years we're going to lose and create more and more deficit in the current situation based on the slow nature of growth more broadly and building.
Okay, thanks. You've got 3 questions, right? One of the slides earlier talked about the character overlay and the adjustment to being character precinct, and the phrase or the statistics seem to be 58% of operative or something. I can't, if you can go back and find that. I just wasn't quite sure exactly what that was telling me.
Yeah, so that figure, I mean, I can take you back through those numbers again. It's really, if we think about our current state is the operative district plan. And we have 307 hectares protected.
Keep going back.
Right, as pre-1930s area. The draft spatial plan went out with a substantial reduction of that to 88.3 hectares, and that's 71.2% reduction from the current operative plan, our current state today. Now, after submissions and after a reclassification process, looking at our background documentation, we have expanded those character areas, what we used to call sub-areas, now character precincts, by an additional 41% from the 72 that we did in the draft plan. The recommendation at the moment is for, effectively, when you look at the current state, a reduction in character precincts from 307 hectares to 127 hectares. It's about a 58% reduction in the current character areas in the operative plan settings.
Okay, so this is releasing.
This is you could look at it and just don't forget that these character areas, not heritage areas, but these character areas didn't prohibit development altogether. They just made it more difficult to develop. Yep. So a 58% reduction is you could look at it as we've made the city 58% more developable.
Yeah, okay, so it's a good thing if we're after development, so thank you for that clarification. Someone's already talked about height also. I'm a bit concerned about that, but So you mentioned earlier how the pre-1930s character precincts is a leftover, if you like, from the current settings, which have been with us for some, I think you said, decades. I mean, in theory, then we should be making these pre-1950s or what have you, right? If we're trying to protect, but I'm just a little bit unsure as to why we feel constrained to maintain these precincts, given the age of these buildings are declining, and they don't make up a significant part of the overall stock, and therefore the concerns around what might happen in these areas are actually not really ameliorated by putting this protection on, because obviously people can still buy up post-1930 stock, flatten them and put in higher buildings anyway. So, or am I misreading that? Maybe not really. Is the 30% maybe in one area, and therefore I don't know.
Sorry, the 30%.
I'm just sort of like, yeah. So I mean, as I understand it, in Mount Vic anyway, 30% of the stock is pre-1930s,
right.
meaning 70% is not, which kind of makes you wonder, well, you know, the sort of problems that can arise from unvetted or development can actually still affect people anyway. And
so thanks, Councillor. It's a difficult question to answer, really. I mean, because the other side of it is that, well, that's why we're trying to protect the remnant housing stock of that nature. But it is what it is. It's currently protected in the scheme. John can advise how many decades it's been in there. It's a current setting. I've kind of already gone over why these things exist in planning schemes, these character precincts and heritage areas.
So the good thing for the city, broadly, that you think?
I think as your chief planning officer, that it is not uncommon to have character areas in cities. It's a well acknowledged planning instrument, and they usually have a lot of evidence, as these ones do, that sit behind it that demonstrate why they should be protected or sensitively developed over time.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Right, Councillor Foon and then O'Neill, and then we're getting round to the second round. No, you've already asked your first lot of questions. These two haven't asked any yet. Yes.
So my questions are also around, well, some of them are on the character areas. So I think that for me, I'm looking through the lens of what I'm seeing in Berhampore is that we've put extra character into places that actually, when I look at them visually, I don't think that they are actually character, or they're not under 130, they're not 130 years old. So that's the question. How did we get to the second phase of deciding that these areas needed to be protected? And I have another question on that while you're, sorry. And the question around that is, why would we not, and thank you, Liam, for describing the topology and the geography, and I really get that, but why would we not take a more granular approach or a site-by-site approach? And is that to do with the workload for us? Like, what are the pros and cons of looking at it that way, rather than blocking off a whole section which looked like it actually needs a bit of love?
So in terms of what we did to review the approach and what we did compared to the draft spatial plan, a lot of the feedback we received was that people just didn't quite understand kind of how we had gotten from our evidence base, which is that pre-1930s character review from 2019 that did a stock take assessment of all of the sites and kind of acknowledged the that one, the character contribution site by site. So we went back and we reviewed and retested our methodology. So just made sure it was refined, clear, and concise. And by doing that process, we did identify areas where, especially in Berhampore,
that area we might have gone a bit far. And so then from that review, it identified areas that have coherent character. So that's again that map that you're looking at from the BOFA MISCL report, the Appendix 4, I think it is. And in that review, we looked at whether or not it was in an indicative character sub-area, which is Appendix 4 of the BOFA, the pre-1930 stocktake assessment, where it notes observable patterns of primary and contributory character, so an overall coherence of character. Our way of applying that was also by looking at the streetscape, so it's why we didn't look at pocket sites, and we kind of were concerned with that whole collective streetscape view and how the overall character contributes to that streetscape. So that's kind of the focus we have gone through. We also looked at qualities of the streetscape, so beyond the character contribution or that level of coherence, kind of what was the land use on the street, what was the nature of development, the pattern of the street itself, the setbacks, the consistency of form and architectural style, and those things. A lot of that is picked up in the pre-1930s character area review, all that data, but we kind of looked at it again and then did site visits to kind of check this after or as part of the review. So on the site visits, again, we looked at heights, visibility of dwellings, the topography changes, and again, streetscape qualities and just that overall consistency of the streetscape. So that's kind of, I hope that answers the question, but that was our thinking in that direction, why we didn't go site by site and why we were trying to alter them. Yeah.
Okay. O'Neill, lucky. Oh, sorry, no, I thought you said yes.
Yeah. So the backup, thank you for that. Although there is a 6-story block in a character area, which I'm trying to figure out.
I think I know exactly which one that was. That is actually, I believe it's noted as detractive in the pre-1930s stocktake, and that site is actually post-1930s. So if a site is post-1930s, the rule wouldn't apply. The thinking with including it in a character precinct moving forward is that since the surrounding area and that surrounding streetscape is included, we would want to have some level of control on the replacement development in terms of like design guidance. So while a developer could come in and go ahead and redevelop that, the thinking is, and they could demolish easier than the pre-1930s ones. It's just trying to have that design consideration since that collective streetscape we've identified has coherent character.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So then the next question was around more of a site-by-site view on how we retain or protect character as opposed to the block, and what are the reasons or the pros and cons of why we wouldn't look at doing it that way? And sorry, I might know it, but it's good to ask here.
I can probably help with this. So as Tabitha's described, the pre-1930s character areas, the whole basis of them is a streetscape view rather than an individual building. So this is where it differs from our listed heritage buildings, which are listed for in their own right. So they have a value that in terms of the site or the building itself, whereas the character areas, it's more of an aesthetic amenity. You walk down the street and it's got that coherent, similar style, similar architecture, similar way that it addresses the street, those kinds of things. So that's the difference there. And that example that you just provided, so we may have buildings within a precinct that are listed as detractive, but as Tabitha's described, the overall streetscape is still generally intact, but there's just one dwelling that might not contribute to that overall streetscape. It doesn't mean that as a whole the streetscape doesn't have value. Does that make sense? Yeah.
One more last question. Just with the building heights, particularly in the central city, have we, just now that we've taken the height limit off, I guess, how does that affect the ability to be able to have some leverage with negotiating things like, rooftop gardens or a percentage of affordable housing? Because I would have thought that was a good opportunity to be able to pull a bit more, let's get what we want out of this deal. So how does that leave us now?
All new buildings in the central city will require resource consent, and that is our primary way of, primary opportunity to negotiate things like that. The new district plan will have new policies that speak to, things like green roofs and other sustainability aspects. So, yeah.
Thank you,
Just
Councillor
one
O'Neill.
quick-
Oh no, sorry, I keep interrupting.
No, that's fair, that's fair. But I guess then that would lead me to a question similar to Tamitha Paul's. Will that require an amendment, or will that just become part of how we might negotiate in the future? If we're after those types of things.
I don't think it requires an amendment because I guess the spatial plan is setting the framework and it'll be followed by the district plan. The spatial plan says that all new buildings under the new district plan will require resource consent. So I think new
as they currently do. I mean, just on that point. So because we don't are not specifying height limits, we're looking at, is there a point at which you'd say at that particular height or that number of apartments that we want to have additional assessment criteria which would bring in the points you were just talking about.
Awesome. Okay, so we've still got.
So we'll bring that back to you because it's really key policy.
That should also be something that could be thought about around the rapid transit routes.
Sorry, hang on. Sorry, I think that's getting just a bit off.
So sort of follow up.
Yeah, I know, but we've got a long list of people who still need to ask questions. You're done. Okay, right, Councillor O'Neill.
Kia ora, thank you. Okay, so my first sort of clump topic question. The MPS on biodiversity and incorporating values, I know that hasn't been passed through government yet, but how consistent is our current spatial plan or our thinking around kind of matching the MPS on biodiversity impact? And I'm interested in SNAs as a minimum and how that applies to greenfield sites.
That's all right. Yeah. Yep. The expert will come in if I get things wrong. They've consulted on a draft. It's on hold at the moment, and there's obviously some debate up north around SNAs and whether it even progresses the NPS. But it's had a long history of just about getting across the line and being then put on hold. I mean, in terms of generally, I suppose we felt, and we came to you and you did a submission on the draft NPS, we felt that as it was structured, it was a little bit regulatory focused. It was very much around, we want these things in the district plan, and our approach has been to engage fully with the landowners, so that with the view that if you slap controls on people, they tend to react adversely. So have a conversation with them around understanding what they understand about the significance of the SNAs, and if they've got development aspirations and those sorts of conversations, what can council do to assist them, those sorts of things. So it's probably fair to say we're a bit more in that camp around showing a bit more flexibility than what the draft NPS was promoting. But we feel, I mean, there has been, by and large, pretty good reaction from the engagement we've had with landowners. There are a few, obviously, who are not happy, but and that will play out through the district plan when we notify. But we are having ongoing conversations with them, and we're trying to come to a solution. So, long story short, I suppose we're a little bit more on the enabling side than the NPS has been signalled, and we think that's actually the way we should do it, because it's, you've got to bring people along with you.
Yeah, okay, I might follow that offline. Walking catchments. So I guess I'm kind of concerned looking at the spatial plan, if we're aiming to be a livable city, but we don't yet have the data for disabled people or people with accessibility requirements included in walking catchments. can we not be a bit more transparent about not having that data yet? Because to me, I guess I'm rather concerned if we aren't including disabled people in walking catchments in a very large plan, then we are making the city less inclusive to those to people in our community. So I guess can we add some?
Yeah, I think that's actually a great point. So I mean, all has already made it several times today that this is going to be a dynamic model, and the great thing is PSR, Park Sports and Recreation, are using the model to understand the network more broadly and where those sort of improvements are needed. But I think being overt about it in our plan is a great idea. So
yeah, I recognise a tough spot. I just think we should be, really clear about that. And then I am curious to understand our own assessments for development capacity and selecting character areas. And I'm really interested to see, I know Councillor Freund just touched on some questions, but if we've got reports or numbers about jumping from the draft amount of character areas to the character areas now in this plan, what is the loss of development capacity in doing so, and how many units or potential dwellings are we losing by increasing character areas?
sorry, so just quickly, there was a similar question earlier on the piece. Yeah. So we've just done some quick numbers now, and hopefully we'll be able to provide some clarity there.
Maybe I can't quite read what you've said.
Oh, okay. So we have had some reviewed our estimates around the distribution of growth around the city as a result of our recommendations on the draft spatial recommendations to change the draft spatial plan. And so in terms of the inner city suburbs, and as a result of the changes, overall, up to 1,000 more people, generally speaking, that these are high-level estimates and subject to all the assumptions around uptake levels. So up to 1,000 more people could be accommodated within the inner suburbs, but that's with the general character overlay removed and with Kelburn added in as an inner suburb.
Sorry,
does it help?
So an increasing character protection.
Yeah, so
we are creating.
So we've increased the character protection.
More homes.
Yeah, so we've increased the character protection, but removed the character overlay, and we've added Kelburn, and that net outcome is.
So it dropped off with the expanding the. It dropped off with expanding the character area protection, but because we've brought in Kelburn, that's brought the numbers back up again, and it's above what we went out.
Yeah, because that was consistent with the opinion of the. Yeah.
Yeah. So you councillors, remember you asked us to go away and consider Kelburn, so that's what we've done, and we're recommending back to you for it to be included.
Cool. And I guess that my main question was around I think in the MPSUD and the RMA reform report, it talks about a specific report needing to be provided should a territorial authority make any amendments to a development capacity. I was wondering if we had that or if that exists. Does that kind of align?
Kate, you go.
So I think what you're referring to there is our requirements as part of the district plan changes to do what they call a Section 32 report.
Yes, yeah.
So we will have to do that as part of the district plan process when we notify. So all the provisions are subject to the Section 32 requirement, which is an evaluation of basically why the provisions we're proposing are the most efficient and effective way of achieving the outcomes we want. So we still have to do that with the pre-1930s character areas, but that is at the district plan stage, not the spatial plan.
Right. And then, sorry, just a spin-off. What would be the difference in potential people housed if we... actually, no, I will follow that up online. Ready to...
Colleagues, we've been here for 3 hours and there's 8 more for second time questions. Do you want to go beyond 5? We're really not going to have much time, or do by...
There might be little...
Okay, so so we're going to need to be just a bit more succinct, and then maybe questions by email, which will then be compiled so that people can see what questions. Awesome. All right, so we've got Councillor...
And CC to all councillors.
Yeah, CC, yep. So Councillor Day and Fitzsimon, do you want to go first because if you have to leave?
We're good.
Yeah, okay, if you don't mind. Yeah. Jill, Jill, do you mind?
I'm just interested in this more work that the council's done on the character areas. So there was quite a lot of factors. There was streetscape, land use, setbacks, site visits. There must be a report or something. Can I not get hold of that?
Yeah, so I think we're preparing some background material, which we're planning to put on the website alongside the explanation of the walking catchment methodology. So that's
how soon
in progress.
Like today? Well, so, we've got 3 days to go. I just want to, and I'm wondering, there's all this work that's gone on. There must be other reports. Like, we need every single thing because we are the decision makers. So I just want to make sure that we're getting every single thing. Well, we have to,
We can provide the detailed analysis around the character work that Tabitha talked to you about. So the explanation of why we've recommended what we have. So within the next day or two before you make your decision. Is that okay?
Yeah, and are there any other reports that are relevant? Because I want everything. I don't want to find out later that there was a whole bunch of stuff the council had that I didn't have and it might have changed my vote.
So all of the documentation around the walking network is quite technical, as in this is how you copy this into this database and run this analysis. But we do have a one-pager that we've been preparing to release to the public, so we can send that on as well.
Cool. And thank you. I just had a question from a resident, and I sort of confidently answered no and then thought, gosh, am I right? They were asking whether adding likely mass rapid transit route would add anything not already included, or whether it's effectively baked in anyway. And I said, no, it's effectively baked in anyway by the MPS and how this works. But then now I've sat through this and I'm starting to question whether that answer was accurate.
I'll let John answer that. It's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question because we have been working closely with Let's Get Wellington Moving, and of course we're not quite in sync with them at the moment. So we think we might have to revisit the spatial plan perhaps and adjust the district plan if, for instance, there's a decision made to go like mass transit route down a particular route. We will have to look at what the intensification proposals are and whether we need to adjust those. So yes, we do need to do that work.
So is it not possible to have an enabling provision that basically says if this, then this?
We've got
Doesn't the MPS kind of do that? Do we need to? Is there anything else we need to do to make sure we're?
I believe the spatial plan has a comment about enabling the infrastructure required. The tricky thing is the station locations, because that's probably where the most uplift will happen. Now we're probably, I'm going to look to my staff for a nod here, but we're at least a year away from a station location, if not longer. If not longer. That's a if not longer long. So nod. So by the time, of course, we've got a draft district plan at the end of this financial year and a proposed plan midway through next year. It's looking pretty tight to have that in a statutory sense, those station locations.
But I guess I'm saying, can't we just agree in principle on a policy approach that will be adopted and then you just apply it?
For the spatial plan, there's probably, if there's not wording, I'll leave it up to John. If there's not wording there already, we can put some additional wording in. Yeah, there is wording in there?
No, there is wording in there. In terms of the opportunity sites, we've identified potential station precincts. And so that's a signal to, so once we know what's proposed, that we can, through the district plan, have an enabling policies to do comprehensive development. And there will be other infrastructure-related issues associated with those too. So we have tried to future-proof it as much as we possibly can.
The opportunity sites didn't seem anything to do with mass rapid transit to me. They're they're not even places that are on any link. That's why that's actually where the question came up.
There are also
they're just described, they're not mapped.
About the rail line stations, which would probably apply to any.
But for
MRT.
Like for example, Island Bay is not in there.
Yeah, it's not mapped. So it's not mapped, but it's referred to in the document.
Okay.
I did ask about this, Heaven, noting that the plan could change as a result, because we are talking about maybe at least 6-storey buildings along the parade, which your constituents.
Yeah, and I guess I want to, like, so people know straight away when the mass rapid transit comes out, what will that mean, and also that we don't waste time going through all this stuff when we actually need to be enabling the development.
Really hard to enable it without knowing where they're going to go. So, and if we're trying to, I mean, there's a whole lot of work happening around that. I don't understand exactly what that is, but there's a lot of confidential, commercial confidentiality around those issues. So, until there's decisions made, we will follow with the appropriate zoning and work to enable that to happen.
Okay, so
but we'll be clear. We'll have a look and see if we can be any more clear. Yep.
To be quicker as well, like, because I know how long these things take, ages, right? It would just be good to know whether there's a way, and there might not be, but is there a way that we enable it faster once we know that route?
Right, so if we can just speed it up a little bit, Councillor Day, then Councillor Matthews.
Okay, so I'm back to Johnsonville because I sort of feel like I haven't quite got to the bottom of the thing with the walkable catchment stuff. So do we use the NZTA, or did you use the guidelines from NZTA around pedestrian planning? Because there's some rules around like 8% gradient over, I think it was 9 metres or something, but there's some guidelines that determine gradient and walkability for pedestrians. Did we use that?
So we referred to NZTA, but we didn't directly use it. And the reason behind that was some of the values that are specified by NZTA didn't quite match up with what we found as realistic. So, for example, NZTA say an average walking speed on flat ground is 5 kilometres per hour, which the majority of people would find quite challenging. So we relied more heavily on our research in terms of what slope. When we did our walking speed to slope comparison, we referred more heavily on our research there.
Okay, so to the research, because I'm really trying to figure out, in Johnsonville we've got quite a specific thing because particular areas have been challenged before on being walkable. I'd be quite interested to see where our research gathered data from, because in Johnsonville some parts you can walk quite easily and won't have the same challenges as you would over particularly the eastern side of the motorway or up Woodland Road. I'm trying to think, if I lived in Burgess Road, which is at the top of Burgess Road, I have to go through quite a steep walkway and then through hollow steps and then under the motorway, and I'm not sure that is particularly easily compared to if you were walking, say, Moorfield Road up Broderick Road. That's quite a different walk, so I'd be really interested to know where our people did walk, because it is quite different. It's not comparing apples with apples, so I don't know if we can get any of that data shared with us. Would be helpful.
Yeah, what I can do is pull together a research that focused on around the Johnsonville area, and I can summarise it and send that out.
That would be really helpful, because it would be quite important for us to understand those 3 particular areas, and if we really have got the data that shows that. My big concern is that, as I say, if I lived in Burgess Road right at the top, which is still in the area, and I was going to the Johnsonville train station, because we've worked out that the edge of that suburban area is where the 10-minute walking catchment is worked out from. So by the time you get from Burgess Road, or even just Sheridan Terrace a bit above, down to the underpass of the motorway, you've still got another probably 5 to 10 minute walk across to get to the station. So we've just created probably more like a 20-minute walk to your public transport route. Then you have to sit on the train and get into the city for 20 plus minutes. Then potentially in the city, there's still a walking catchment area that applies to people trying to get to their part in the city, because our train station stops on the edge. So we've actually probably created more like a 15-20 minute walkable catchment for people in Johnsonville, possibly even longer, compared with people in the city. So I guess I wonder what would happen if we changed the designation for Johnsonville to be 10 minutes from the station rather than from the edge of the catchment, because that wouldn't necessarily change the bits to the west of it or to the south, but it particularly impacts the east, which compounded with that is steep. So it's kind of like it's got a different catchment issue around it. What would happen if we applied what we're applying for all other transit routes rather than the suburban edge thing because it's a metropolitan area.
Yeah, so the MPS UD requires us to do the walking catchment from the edge of the metropolitan centre. So what we have in Johnsonville is actually an overlap of 2 walking catchments. We have the catchment around the railway station, and then we have the catchment around the metropolitan centre. So what we show on the map and where we've enabled growth is in the overlap between those. Well, it's the summation of those 2 walking catchments.
So could we do, because I'm thinking like literally to get from that side of the catchment area to the train station, for example, is about a 5-minute walk. So could we do a 5-minute from the outside of the catchment, which would then take that into it? Because obviously the MPS says to use that catchment area, but it doesn't actually determine what that walkable thing has to be, because in NIO we're saying 5 to 10 minutes, so why would we change that here when the Canberra of the land is not particularly great for accessibility? Do you want to add to that, Jenny?
So just thinking that we could do, for example, a 10-minute walking catchment from the train station, but a 5-minute walking catchment from the edge of the metropolitan area, which wouldn't necessarily, which wouldn't necessarily be the same thing. They would overlap in different ways.
Yeah, we can look into that to see how the overlap looks. Yeah, we could look into that and get back to you on how that looks.
Thank you, that would be really helpful. I also just want to make some quick comments and questions about the Our Place work. I guess one of my questions is how long we think it will stay relevant for, because the reality is if we talk to our communities right now, what they will say will change quite quickly potentially as things change, and then how long does a vision statement stay relevant for something like that? But my other question is, I guess, who do we listen to? If you talk to my 16-year-old daughter, she'll say as soon as she can move out of Tawa, she will, and she probably won't come back because it doesn't meet the needs of a particular age group, and it really is quite a unique area, and it works really well for many people, but we're missing some things, and if we just listen to probably the people who will put themselves forward, it might not actually tell us what the community could be, and also how much detail will we go into with the Our Place stuff. Also, given that our communities are telling us that they have consultation fatigue. So I'm just aware that we might be stepping into something which we suddenly go, whoa, our communities
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. So I think it's a pilot, and we've got to report back on what the detail of that engagement looks like. I have had experience and am aware of processes that run in a 3-year cycle to time with the LTP. I'm not sure we'll have to do it that frequently, but we'll have a think about that question. And sorry, what was your other question? It's getting late in the day.
I asked a few things, but I guess one of the things is that community often gets frustrated.
Oh, sorry, the engagement fatigue. Yeah, so well, there's 2 things, wasn't there? There was engagement fatigue, and then there was how to ensure we've got the right people connecting into the program, and it's the people we expect to live there, but also people that are renting or another sort of form of accommodation. That's the detail in the engagement program. I've yet to see it from the team in terms of how that looks.
I think the questions are key, because one of the questions in the document that really concerned me was, what would you never want your community to lose? And I thought, wow, some people will say we don't want to lose anything that we currently have. Other people will say we don't want to lose the opportunity. But yeah, I think the questions are going to be key. But I do worry that we're going to sort of get ourselves tangled up, and the community will, in some way, some people will see this as an opportunity to try and say, not here, please don't do this here, rather than...
Yeah, well, that's not the intention, of course. But look, I think I've already taken this feedback on board from a number of councillors that we need to workshop exactly how that engagement program looks to give you the confidence that...
And I think also communities, they do get a bit wary that they give us feedback on things and then they never see anything happen. And this particular one will actually probably never really, in their eyes, come to fruition. And we'll have done all this consultation, got them all excited, and then nothing will probably change for quite a long time, because the reality is it will happen in incremental bits. It's hard enough even when we did like the Tawa Plaza upgrade, which was fantastic, but it happened over a long period of time. Yeah. But actually there was something to show at the end of it. But I'm concerned if we go and talk about values and stuff, they'll be like, council never listened to it, even though we quite likely will have. It'll be really hard to show the value for what we've taken people through.
Yeah, look, I acknowledge all of those concerns, and ultimately it's a decision of council whether it wants to proceed with the program or not.
Okay, so 2 people with 15 minutes. We've still got 1, 2, 5. Do you still want to finish at 5? Because just people might need to make alternative arrangements. You want to finish? Okay, so Sarah, Well, no, actually, no, we do have an order. So,
Okay, right.
yeah, so, okay, so Rebecca, and if we can just be, and follow up with email.
Okay, I've got two questions. The first one is a follow-up to what Terry was asking for about the Section 32 report. And my problem with that being, I want to know why that is scheduled to be part of the district plan rather than the spatial plan, because my understanding is that the NPS requires us to do a cost-benefit analysis of qualifying matters. So this is the character. So it means that we're supposed to vote to put a whole lot of character protection in, and then actually we don't know what the costs and benefits of that are. We've only had the individual assessments of the houses and the streetscapes. I've got one other question after that.
Yeah, so I'll try to answer that, but I'll ask the team to help out as well. So the qualifying matters is 3.32 of the NPS. What the NPS then directs you to is 3.33 subsection 3, which actually is the requirements for qualifying matters, and that's the reference we've made prior to the evidence in the Boffin-Miskell Report 2019 regarding the character precincts. What the team are talking about relating to section 30, so that's the matter when we talk about and have got guidance from MFE staff about the character precincts. That's when we refer back to that 3.3 section, 3.33 section. That's the material qualifying matters. The requirements is the material we've referred to as the Boffin-Miskell Report 2019. The section 32 analysis is a much more onerous level of detail that is only really produced when you're actually writing the rules. So in terms of the NPS, our recommendation to council is that we believe, as recommended, based on the NPS 3.32, 3.33, the Boffin-Miskell Report, the evidence required to qualify that matter for an exemption is there. The section 32 analysis is something quite deeper and quite different. Do you guys want to?
Oh, yeah, I mean, all that's absolutely right. I think it's just, so obviously we give effect to the NPS through the district plan, and so when we have to notify the district plan or a plan change to give effect to those intensification policies no later than August next year. So at that point, when we notify, we must have the Section 32 report. So that will build on, as Liam was saying, the work that the Boffin-Miskell evidence base, plus all the work that we have done, and you'll see that Tabitha has done in terms of translating that evidence through into a policy proposal, which you are considering. But there is a lot more, there's still further work that would need to be done to meet the test of the Section 32, but that's absolutely key, and that's key for every part of the district plan.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still got a concern that we've got the analysis of the streetscape, but we don't actually have the overall kind of argument about why we should be protecting this character and what actually we lose by protecting it. But that's fine, that can be for debate. My last remaining question is around heritage protection and how many of these protected houses are actually heritage protected, and doesn't heritage protection give you a higher level of actually preserving these houses? Because yes, while it's got demolition control under this proposal, you could do a whole lot of things that actually don't, that sort of stuff around with your streetscape without demolishing.
I don't know the number, sorry, in terms of numbers of heritage buildings, or there are some heritage areas too, but I mean, we have to look at that carefully in terms of the controls and where they sit relative to the character areas. And yes, you're right, there is a lot more protection ascribed to heritage areas and heritage buildings, which are over and above what the pre-1930s character areas are. So, yeah, as I said before, we're looking at two different policy issues here in terms of the heritage, which is a much higher test. And so if someone wanted to do something to a heritage building, there's all sorts of controls that might, quite strict in terms of, the window, the timber, the look and feel and those sorts of things. A lot more control than would apply in the pre-1930s areas.
Okay, thank you. Right, Councillors Condie, Free and Calvert, and we're done. Thank you.
Thanks again on the character areas. I guess I'm just interested in whether we could use heritage protection of building facades, kind of saying that these are contributory buildings to accomplish relatively the same thing. So this is kind of getting to the point about whether we're using the right tool. So we may want to preserve the streetscape, but creating these character precincts is not the only way to do that. So I guess any thoughts that we have on that?
Again, there's much higher test with the heritage, so I would say a lot of these pre-1930s, well, absolutely, a lot of these pre-1930s areas would not meet the test for a heritage protection. And to have a heritage facade across, are you saying large areas of the pre-1930s would be, I don't think it'd meet that test. So this is a lesser form of control, enables more development, not a lot more development, but it does allow development. So I'm not sure that that's feasible.
Well, I guess it's thinking about a number of councillors think that the character precincts are too large. So I'm thinking about how you could make them smaller. And if you were making them smaller areas that were more targeted, but potentially around heritage buildings, then you might use a different tool to do that, and whether that was a possibility.
Well, I mean, it is a fair point. I mean, if you are of the view, councillors, that pre-1930s is not a legitimate form of control to protect character, and what you should really be focusing on is heritage, then there'll be much smaller areas and only a few buildings here and there dotted around the city in those areas. So much less control would be applied to those areas. Yes.
Right, Councillor Free.
So I really want to know a little bit more about this enable at least 6 stories. Does that mean that if it's, when would you need a resource consent? And I really think we need to spell this out because it has not been very clear. And as somebody said, this is actually quite an important point, both in terms of knowing what developers actually can do and how much we're enabling, and both also, you know, from some people who perhaps don't really necessarily want that to happen. And at the moment, I feel it's not clear. So what is actually the case around the transit routes? Can you of right build up to 6 stories and then have to get a resource consent? Do you have to get a resource consent for everything? Can you build, like, when do you need a resource consent? When can you just do it? And what does this actually mean?
Okay, so multi-unit developments currently in the district plan, 3 or more need a resource consent.
But so I'm interested in what you can do without a resource consent. So let's take it that way.
1 or 2 you could do. And 1 or 2 stories. So
I really think it needs to be a whole lot clearer.
Yeah. Okay. So with the at least 6 stories, so you're likely looking at a multi-unit that would need a consent for being a multi-unit. And if it failed to meet any of the standards like height recession planes and those sorts of things, it would need a resource consent for that aspect also. So I think by and large, most developments at that sort of height would need a resource consent, at which point the design guide would be applied and all the policies in the district plan would then be applied to the assessment of that development.
So is the ultimate control then is the height planes on the height, because you're not actually saying there's a cut-off of the height, you're saying there's a resource consent required which will consider all these things.
So in terms of the at least, there is a, through the district plan, there'll be some areas where we might say 6 stories is the limit. There might be other areas you say 8 stories might be okay. So there's still the district plan process which will give a much more refined approach to what that means, okay? And just to go back though, in terms of most developments will need a resource consent.
We're in a bit of a grey space here, Councillor, because it's remember this is the blueprint we're talking about, not the rule book. The rule book is currently being written, so through the councillor working groups, we'll be able to provide you with a bit more clarity. At the moment, the current policy setting is a permitted baseline of 2 dwellings, double storey on a block, and medium density development of 3 dwellings. And it remains to be tested what the district plan rules will be, to your point, on 6 stories, 4 stories or whatever. that depends on the rule writing and the rule book.
Right, enough. Right. Councillor Calvert, are you there? Yes, she's last, but not least.
Thank you. I'm just going to try and get myself sorted. Yeah. Thank you. Just want to question why I understand there's quite a bit of work required in Karori. They need a new, essentially, sewage system. But why is this scheduled for almost the third tranche? Because there is a large catchment there in terms of size and a willingness to intensify, and a very small town centre, which is not relative to the size of the suburb. So could somebody advise me why this is in the third tranche?
It's basically because it's going to take quite some time to design and get consent for the new infrastructure that's required there. Wellington Water have advised that it will be a long and tricky process, so that's kind of the reasoning for the timing. If there was, some amazing solution that became obvious sooner, then, that's great. I think Karori would be a great place to put more intensification. Yeah.
So can we get a report? Where does Wellington Water say that? Is that in their reports that we received from them last year, or the 15th of March report? Can you point me to where that's written down?
There is a commentary in the earlier reports, specifically around Karori, and there is a summary comment in the most latest report as well about Karori and its challenges. So across all of those reports. Yep.
I know, I appreciate these challenges, but I'm really concerned it takes 20 years to design and consent something, for something like this. And I'm unclear, and maybe you can come back to me, why it takes 20 years to design and consent a water sewage system, because it doesn't bode well for anywhere else in the city or greenfields or wherever if it's going to take that long. And given the problems of Karori are well known, the other thing is, we talked a lot about character areas, and I know I'm probably going to upset some of my colleagues here, but we talk about character in respect of heritage. But then we heard from our chief planning officer how character there are other elements to character other than heritage. So how is this being applied across the city? And I will say that Kandala has had a character assessment plan done, or character assessment done in 2015, and how this, and I can even from here, I can see a few smiles on people's faces. So anyway, bear with me. How this has been factored in.
Yeah, sorry, Councillor, I wasn't smiling at you. Sorry, was it? Yeah, I was just.
No, it was Councillor. I was Councillor Condi, actually.
Okay. I was trying to find out where you're going with the point. So, look, correct. I think that work's done. John can talk to the detail, but we're starting. Our starting point is what's currently in the plan, and for whatever reason, officers haven't looked to adopt a character overlay or a character control over Kandala and Io for reasons beyond me, but it's probably before my time, but I'll let John talk detail.
Liam's correct. We did go, the base assumption was let's look at the existing settings, and people have come to us and said, why aren't you including pre-1940s or pre-1950s or whatever it might be? And so we did make a call around the work that it was based on the existing, which was pre-1930s, and they represent all the older inner suburbs of Wellington. So, if we extended beyond that, well, there'd be large parts of the city you could potentially look at and potentially protect, but, it's within the context of the city's growing and we need to enable growth in different places around the city. That probably, that's a policy call, but that's where we came from, Councillor.
Okay, so there's a possibility that there could be if it was a policy decision that we could consider a character overlay for Kandala and other suburbs.
Yeah, well, there's always a possibility for planning controls, depending on the governance team that want to shape how their city looks and feels in the future. But look, I haven't seen the background report, Councillor, but hill suburbs like that generally have, and I know this because I think the earlier development history of Kandala Nio has seen quite substantial change. They were quite large blocks to begin with, and as a result, it's seen a lot of gentrification and change over time, and therefore has a very, very broad range of representation and architectural styles. And what is very, very relevant, I think, to Kandala is the heritage, the vegetation aspect. And that is a standout when you do drive through there. Different type of control, whether it's SNA or just protected trees more broadly, but I suspect it would be quite difficult to establish an architectural character to those suburbs as opposed to its more gardenscape environment.
And that was, that work that was done, Councillor Calvert's referring to, was part of a proposal for medium density in that area. So, and that didn't go ahead. But and you're quite right, Liam, it picked up on the existing vegetation, how important that was to the overall character of Kandala, just like it is in other parts of the city.
Okay, I'm going to dust that off again. You'll be pleased to know. The other thing with the neighbourhood planning, and I'm really keen to see with the neighbourhood planning that there's an opportunity for neighbourhoods to contribute where densification can happen, because we know that there's lots of pockets, and the topography of the city enables more densification in some areas than others. We're not a flat piece of land, and I do know a particular property in Crofton Downs, which could, against a hill, which could have more development. So I'm keen to see that as part of it, but it wasn't part of it, was it? I wasn't sure whether that's the sort of thing that was going to be included. Sorry, I can't hear.
Sorry, could you just ask the question again, Councillor? Sorry.
Yeah, it's just about in terms of the neighbourhood planning, were you envisaging that communities would be able to suggest areas for densification?
No, Councillor, we weren't.
Okay. I wonder whether that's a possibility. And also whether you could you could pilot. You've got two main suburban centres that you're piloting, Tawa and Newtown. And I understand you're not doing Johnsonville because it might be a little bit more trickier than Tawa. But could you look at doing a smaller suburban centre along the same lines? Because when you just pilot with two big ones, some of the smaller ones are a bit different, and I wondered whether Berrimpore being adjacent to Newtown might be a good option.
That's a good point, Councillor. I mean, we can look at that. I think it's important first that council makes a decision whether it wants to progress with the pilots or not. But during debate, you can suggest that, and I'm sure it's possible.
Okay, thank you. That's all. I'll send my other ones through.
All right, officers, thank you very much for your.
Ask a matter of resource consents. When would you need to notify resource consent? What are the sort of tests for that?
Could that maybe be responded by email?
Yeah, we could take that offline. I just want to, if it's by your leave, Madam Chair, I just want to acknowledge the work that the team have done and whoever's on Zoom. They've been working really, really hard at this. I want to acknowledge Sherilyn in particular, who's been leading the spatial plan, and certainly this infrastructure spearhead. I also want to acknowledge David Chick as well. This work started with his vision for the city. He started that program, Our City Tomorrow. This is a culmination or a step in that. David's work is best practice in my opinion, and I want to acknowledge Moana, who's looked after this program in the past as well, before I started, and has guided it and got it to this point. I'm really proud to be able to carry that legacy on and represent the best possible recommendations to council that we can, and on balance and objectively. So I appreciate that, and I hope the debate goes well on Thursday.
Okay, thank you very much, the whole team. Appreciate it, and to colleagues. Thank you.
No more questions though, right?